the endorsements of A-listers. Lizzie.
Checking in on these markets, you've got oil slumping off the back of the Israel attack on Iran. Seems counterintuitive, but of course they avoided those oil facilities, hence not as big of a reaction as you might have expected. The yen slumping on the Japanese elections, less prospect of BOJ hikes. Does that bring the carry trade back into vision? You've got futures on both sides of the pond pointing higher. The countdown to the opening trade starts right now.
The opening trade starting right now, and the focus right now on what's happening in Japan, but also the Middle East, of course, with the moves in those oil markets. The yen softer, the Nikkei up, so how we pass what happens next in the days ahead for Japan is going to be consequential. And this is all before we've wrestled with the earnings story and with the data out of the US, not to mention the budget, not to mention, of course, US elections.
Not a boring Monday at all. Plenty to digest, and a lot of it coming from different parts of the world. And we're kind of trying to fold it all together. Let's go right to our top story here, especially coming out of Japan. Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba has promised to restore stability after his gamble on a snap election backfired. His ruling Liberal Democrat coalition failed to win a majority in parliament. Forget this, the first time in 15 years. Let's get the latest out of Japan. Alistair Gale joins us this morning. Alistair, put this into context for us. What does this do to the policy in Japan?
Well, there's really a great deal of uncertainty here. As you say, Prime Minister Ishiba has said that he wants to continue. He wants to serve out as the Prime Minister for the foreseeable future, but he's lost his majority, which means that he's going to have a tough time in Parliament. He will be relying on opposition parties to work with him on specific issues. It doesn't look like he's going to get any parties to join his coalition to bring stability. So really, we might be looking at a logjam in terms of policy making. The priorities that the Prime Minister has, including increasing defence spending through tax hikes, now look to be in jeopardy. The opposition parties have more leverage. They want things like tax cuts. So we're going to have a lot of horse trading, a lot of sort of uncertainty over the future for the economy here. And we're seeing the impact of that in markets, with the yen, of course, falling. And also, you know, Japan's role in the world is under scrutiny now because who's going to be the leader? I mean, Ishiba was supposed to go to the G20, supposed to go to APEC next month, perhaps go to the US and see who wins the US election. But now the priority really is sort of dealing with these issues here in Japan. And so he needs to focus on the domestic side of things, trying to make sure essentially that his government doesn't collapse. So it's a pretty dire situation for Ishiba.
Okay, Alistair Gale in Tokyo. Thank you very much indeed. I was jumping in on you, Chris. Yeah, I apologise for that. There's a couple of factors here that I think are really fascinating when it comes to Japan. One is we're kind of back to the normal Japan politics, which is the short-lived premierships of these leaders.
Yeah.
Now, Ishiba is still in the post, but let's see what happens, because there's real question marks about whether or not he maintains that post. Abe had that longevity, but to some extent, in the modern history of Japan, that's relatively unusual. 18 months, 2 years is normally the kind of lifespan of prime ministers in Israel, politically, of course. And then this question is whether or not the move in the end makes sense, given that some of the opposition parties have talked about actually moving the inflation target not to 2% but around 0%. So inflation is a factor here, and if they're concerned about inflation, then could that mean higher rates? I wonder if that's being underpriced, given that some of the opposition parties, they're concerned about inflation. To get inflation down, you need higher rates. Is that being underpriced at this point?
Well, I think it's also interesting in that this is crucial in that the LDP's majority for so long, for 15 years, and then back to 1955 is enormous here. And a lot of the reason that they're kind of losing some of that strength or historical strength that they've had is because of domestic issues like inflation. Yes, the party has dealt with plenty of its scandals on its own, but it is an inflationary story at the end of the day, which, by the way, you're seeing in Europe, you're seeing in Canada. If we're talking about this idea of raising taxes to increase defense policy, where have we heard that before? Right here in Europe. And I think it's fascinating that Alistair made the point of who represents Japan at the G20, simply because when you look at the likes of the G7 in particular, and you're trying to say, well, how are we going to combat the strength of China? You have Japan, France, Germany, Canada, all looking at domestic weakness where the leadership is in peril. So in the face of a U.S. election, who outside of the US takes that charge.
Yeah, and it means that you get countries that are not necessarily so strong domestically actually becoming leaders on the international stage, which has been so far Keir Starmer's advantage from the UK, weirdly, when things have been quite rocky over the summer.
He's still got a massive majority. He's still politically strong.
Spread thinly and across the country, Tom.
Okay. I think we're going to move on right now to the Middle
Yeah.
East, which is, of course, and we wrestled with this over the weekend as to what to prioritise, because clearly the yen moving. But then the oil moves have been pretty significant. And to what extent this is actually a de-risking moment when it comes to this region. Oil then slumping after Israel struck military targets, and that's what's important, across Iran over the weekend, but avoided those crude facilities. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's executive editor for the Middle East, North Africa and Russia, just covering all of that for us, Stuart Livingston-Wallace. Stuart, a busy weekend, no doubt, for you and the team. Talk to us about the fact that these attacks, the retaliation from Israel, were relatively, at least, more restrained than many, at least some, had expected. What does it tell us about the role of the US? What does it tell us about how this unfolds from here?
Yeah, good morning. So there's multiple ways you can interpret this. So yes, on the face of it, they didn't go after the nuclear facilities, they didn't go directly after the oil facilities. So that is perhaps less bearish than it could have been. However, a couple of things to bear in mind. Number one, this is far from over. So yes, Iran's Supreme Leader came out yesterday and was relatively restrained in his response. That doesn't mean the Iranians are not going to respond at some point in the next few weeks. Number two, Israel's still going to go after Hezbollah, it's still going to go after Hamas, it's still going to go after the Houthis and the other proxies in the region, and that in turn may provoke exactly what we've seen over the last several months, which is basically forcing Iran to show that somehow it has some capability of striking Israel. Now, again, it's had two goes, and so far has failed on both of those, but that doesn't mean it can't do it again. And then the third thing to bear in mind is what exactly was Israel's strategy here over the longer term. So you saw that it took out some air defences in Syria, you saw that it took out some of the air defences in Iran. Is that effectively setting the stage, or at least warning that it could set the stage for further strikes in the months ahead if it is provoked? So those are all the things to bear in mind. In terms of that oil reaction, yes, it's a big sell-off today. I'm not sure there was much of a risk premium in there in the first place. But again, maybe the oil market is being a little bit too optimistic about what the next couple of months might look like.
All right, Stuart Livingston-Wallace in Dubai, we thank you. Really interesting to tie this into the international context. Of course, we've got the Future Investment Initiative happening in Saudi Arabia this week, big conference. Saudi and the UAE as well condemning this strike on Iran, not naming Israel, but then, how does Saudi get blowback in terms of its relationships here? The US signalling to Saudi that it will help the kingdom against an attack by Iran or its proxies. And then think as well about how this feeds into the conflict in Eastern Europe. If Russia helps Iran replace what was attacked here, that could trigger a surge in US and Israeli weapons to Ukraine. So it all ties together between these different wars.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one as well that we're seeing this. I'm going to bring it back to the markets here, that in that we're seeing a 5% drop in oil. This idea that the geopolitical risk isn't necessarily, we say that's not priced in, that the markets are quite complacent, but there's far more downside risk to oil prices than there is upside risk. And that to me is really staggering in terms of how this market is reacting to what are some pretty scary headlines, to Lizzie's point, out of the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, top line, right? You get Israel attacking Iran, and then suddenly oil moves lower. And to some extent, that's counterintuitive. Of course, to your point, the worst case scenarios have been priced in, at least to some level. And so that suggests that maybe the markets have been doing their job. They're de-risking to a degree. And I wonder, Critty, what you think about what happens if you get Trump in the White House, because his stance in that region is fascinating, given that he was the architect of the Abraham Accords, but also someone who hasn't shown much sensitivity to the plight of the Palestinians. So how that plays out and reshifts, if of course he's elected, could be pretty consequential.
Yeah, City lowering its 12-month Brent forecast to $60 a barrel. It'll be interesting if you see others following suit.
Yeah, a really fascinating one. At the same time, this is of course what's going on around the world. We covered Japan, we covered the Middle East. Let's talk about what's happening right here in Europe. And that of course is restructuring in the auto space.
Yeah, and look, this is a reminder, you may get pretty significant industrial action on the back of this. Look, Oliver Crook in Berlin has covered this conclusively for us, but it's a really big day, really big week for VW. We're talking about the brand VW as well as the broader group. The brand, they're going to be telling employees, this is the latest, Labour leaders plan to inform employees at 11 German sites about the latest negotiations on the company. So there's an expectation that employees are going to have to take a pay cut on the back of this. We already know that Volkswagen, for the first time, I believe in its history, is considering shuttering some of its plants.
Yeah.
And part of this, again, comes down to that brutal competition with cheap, highly innovative, tech-heavy Chinese competitors.
Yeah.
And how that unfolds. We had some new lines out of China as well, out of Beijing, in terms of trying to negotiate with car makers individually when it comes to the tariff story.
The Handelsblatt story is also really interesting here in terms of what those cost-cutting measures actually look like. We're talking about 4 billion euros, which, by the way, is not chump change for anyone that's watching. We're talking about wage increases, getting a universal 10% pay cut. Would you keep working for a company if you got a 10% pay cut no matter what you did? And the fact that this is the depth they have to go to save their company, to me, is staggering. And again, speaks to this idea that inflation, these restructuring stories from 4 years ago, are very much catching up in a lot of corporate Europe and around the world. This is going to be a topic of conversation going into not just right now, into the rest of the show, but in the weeks and months ahead. Let's tell you what we've got coming up on the program today. A couple of very interesting CEO conversations. Bosch CEO will be joining us at 8:15 a.m. UK time, getting us his view on the European auto industry, how that ripples effects across the supply chain. Plus, Sika's chief, Thomas Hassler, will be laying out the construction materials company's latest earnings. Lizzie mentioned that U.S. tariff story, does that show up in other parts of the world's kind of commodity sectors, plus the China story, all of that on the topic. We'll also be talking about markets with KPMG's UK's chief economist and BlackRock's head of EMEA investment strategy at the Open. Plus, what I'm really excited about, we're talking about the countdown to the election, 8 days away. Peter Chase from the German Marshall Fund will be with us to talk about that EU-US trade. What does that look like? Tariffs, quotas, worse, all of that on the table.
Yeah, and on Tuesday, in terms of the week book, in terms of what to think about for the rest of the week, we get the US jobs data as well, out of the US, so a bit of a gauge in terms of how that jobs market is shaping out. And then, of course, we're really kicking off with the tech earnings, Alphabet earnings crossing on Tuesday. Wednesday, we get the UK budget. Of course, Lizzie will be all across that for us. Been described something as a make or break moment, maybe a bit hyperbolic on that front, but certainly very, very significant. Meta also reporting, and Microsoft. And then you have GDP prints out of the US and the Euro area as well. On Thursday, we have inflation data out of the Eurozone. I wonder to what extent deflation, disinflation is going to be more of the stories. We look at companies like VW pushing through 10%, potentially 10% pay cuts. Apple and Amazon also reporting on Thursday, so another bumper day for earnings. And on Friday, yes, non-farm payrolls expected to come in pretty weak, in fact, around 100,000 or so, certainly sharply down from the previous month. So to what extent that tells us about a softening labour market. Bloomberg Economics still thinks you're going to get the unemployment rate still around that 4% level.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. And well, I feel like, Lizzie, this is your time to shine here. What are you watching for when it comes to Wednesday?
We've got the expectations pretty well laid, actually, by the Chancellor when it comes to changing the fiscal rules, tax hikes, and cutting public spending. Or does she shift public spending perhaps to the National Health Service? But it's pretty amazing that they've managed to lay the groundwork for such a shift when you consider that these are not popular measures. Is the bond market reaction that we saw last week all there's going to be? I'm interested to ask someone.
Well, they still can't define what a working person is. If you own shares and you're working, you're not a working person.
Is Keir Starmer a working person?
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating one. I mean, these themes keep coming up no matter what region we look at. Inflation, tax hikes, and then, of course, wage increases, unions, those negotiations.
Exactly. Well, let's get to some of the other stories that you need to know this morning. Bloomberg has learned that Boeing is planning to start a capital raise of more than $15 billion as early as today. Sources say the transaction could include shares and debt that could be converted into equity. The embattled plane maker needs the money to maintain its investment grade rating and pay for eventual recovery from a crippling strike by factory workers. In other news, France's credit rating has been put on a negative outlook by Moody's Ratings. It's the third warning in the space of 2 weeks and comes amid the deterioration of public finances and political challenges in containing swollen budget deficits. Moody's says the decision reflects the increasing risk that France's government would be unlikely to implement measures that would prevent a deterioration in debt affordability. And Georgia's ruling party has declared victory in parliamentary elections that opponents said were rigged. International observers highlighted several shortcomings they said marred the outcome. The country's president says she refuses to accept the results of a, quote, Russian-style election. So those are some of the big stories that we're watching around the world, Christy, this morning.
Yeah, I mean, the election story out of Georgia is fascinating as well, and it comes right on about 8 days away from the U.S. election, which, of course, has dominated a lot of the headlines over the weekend. We saw a major rally rally, of course, in Madison Square Garden in New York City. We had the likes of Elon Musk, Melania Trump making comments as well, not to mention Tucker Carlson, the Fox News host who most recently has interviewed Putin, among many, many others. We also got some pretty big endorsements for Kamala Harris. Bad Bunny, if anyone's, I don't know if you're familiar. Are you a Bad Bunny fan?
Jenny, didn't it?
Yes.
There we go. I am cool.
Bad Bunny. Is it Bad Bunny?
It's Bad Bunny. Well,
Yeah.
this is why it's important. It's not just for the music, although he is fabulous. What we do have to keep in mind is he gets a big chunk of the Puerto Rican vote. So this is something that both candidates were really looking for in terms of getting that minority vote, and specifically Puerto Ricans in the likes of Miami and other parts of the world.
Did he time it on the back? So this comedian stood up in Madison Square Garden. So some people have pushed back and said it's just a comedian. But the language
A
that was
floating
used.
island of garbage, he called
Are we
Puerto
normal?
Rico.
He's a comedian, okay? Maybe the vetting wasn't very good. Is that a risk to the Trump campaign? Are we normalizing some of this language?
Well, we should say that they've distanced themselves from those comments, but they chose this comedian. They knew what sort of material he likes to bring into the party. Trump's childhood friend as well, calling Harris the devil at this event.
Look, you're in the last 8 days of the campaign trail. The two very different candidates taking two very different approaches, and I think what the commonality is between both of them, if they're bringing out the heavyweights, Elon Musk on one side, Bad Bunny and Beyonce on the other. I mean, take your pick. And at the meantime, you are really starting to see this coming down to the wire. Something that's going to be a big topic of discussion throughout the rest of the program, and of course in the 8 days ahead. But coming up, we're going to look ahead to this week's big bank earnings in Europe. UBS, Santander, BNP Paribas, all set to report with their numbers. Plus, of course, we're going to check on those big market stories on the day, with yen and oil both very much in focus. Does one impact the other? We're going to keep an eye on that. And of course, later, Bosch CEO Stefan Hartung sits with our very own Oliver Crook talking about autos, appliances. I'm sure the U.S. election will come up. Stick with us, plenty more ahead. If you have any questions of your own or for our guests, send them to us. IB plus BBTV Go is the function on your terminal. This is Bloomberg.
Jumpstart your trading day on Bloomberg Open Interest.
2 hours of single stock stories that are driving the opening bell action. We'll take you to Wall Street, Main Street, the C-suite, and beyond.
These are companies that are growing their market.
Great companies in the U.S. are the companies hitting the cutting edge. That's a different story.
Get the inside track on what's buzzing in markets.
With the players who are shaping the narrative.
If you have bad earnings reports, you're going to get punished.
They're not buying what the industry is selling. Join us on Bloomberg Open Interest. Weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern, only on Bloomberg.
Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
As we spend some time here on the broader presidential race.
Let's focus in on European politics.
Makes you wonder how politics might play out.
The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
A lot of things we've done which I think are bad, whether you're Democrat or Republican or you support, it's often done in the name of good, have hurt the lower 20%. They're dying younger, their incomes didn't go up for 20 years, they're the ones who have more crime in their neighborhoods, their schools don't work. I think we have to be very clear-headed about how we can accomplish what we want to accomplish to lift up all of America.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Welcome back to the opening trade.
This is Bloomberg Technology.
This is the Asia Tree.
This is Wall Street Week. Welcome to Balance of Power.
This is Bloomberg.
If you get a call from Joe Embiid, your star player, and you get a simultaneous call from one of your children, which call do you take first?
I'll
pick up my son really quick. I can call you back. I'm out with you. I'll pay.
Wednesday, Chancellor of the Exchequer Rachel Reeves delivers the UK's annual budget, the first for the Labour government after 14 years in opposition. How will the Treasury balance investing for growth while dealing with the deficit? And which tax increases will she use to meet the challenge? Live from Westminster, Bloomberg Television brings you special coverage, starting with the Chancellor's statement to Parliament at 12:30 p.m. UK time. Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
We're 40 minutes away from the opening trade. Green on the screen when you look at the futures. It's interesting given that we did end, of course, Friday's session in the red. Is this simply just buying at the start of what's going to be already a very volatile week? Perhaps some of the risk sentiment folding over from Asia as well. We know, of course, Japanese assets are rallying at the moment. Risk assets are rallying at the moment, of course, off of the LDP election. That's going to affect tax plans, which is, by the way, a very familiar topic in this part of the world. Let's bring in and chief economist over at KPMG joins us around this table. Yale, a pleasure to have you on the program. Look, we're talking about taxation and the impact, of course, in Japan and the facts of the election, but it's a topic that's going to really be on our radars this week with the UK and, of course, with France if their own tax plans get voted through. I want to take a big picture approach here. How effective could taxes be in terms of funding some of the deficits, but at the expense of some of that corporate growth? How are you thinking about it?
Well, I mean, I think you do really need to be clever about your tax policy. And one of the key things, though, is stability. And what we hear from companies is they want that certainty and they want to have a longer-term horizon. So I think the trick is really...
Yeah. Sorry, we're going to help... Right now, the French debt to GDP ratio is going to be very crucial here when we're talking about these taxation issues. How much of it does ultimately kind of help?
The forecast, and when you look at what economists are thinking of at the moment, it is definitely an important factor, looking at trade, looking at what tariffs are going to do. And we have seen the EU, at least on the EU level, politicians starting to think about it as well.
Yeah, This is such a moment in the UK with the budget on Wednesday in terms of it being the first Labour budget in 14 years. Do you expect that there'll be a rabbit out of the hat moment, a la the Bank of England's independence all those years ago?
Yeah, it's a really nice question. I think not. I think the current chancellor is going to try and play very steady and not bring extra surprises. I think we've seen quite a lot of the big picture already trailed. It is possible that this is really what we're going to get. What the tweaks are going to be in terms of the exact tax changes, it's still to be seen. But in terms of the ballpark size of change, I think it is becoming quite clear already.
So you actually think that she's done, Chancellor Rachel Reeves, a good job of expectations management? Do you think that this gilt market reaction last week is all we're going to see?
Let's hope so. I think within the envelope, she probably has done a fairly good job trailing it early, and trying to put it in the context of stability. Obviously, we do need to see the details, and I think that will be very important for markets. But hopefully, that would be it.
When it comes to that infrastructure spend, because they're changing the fiscal rule in part to fund additional infrastructure, what are the long and variable lags of infrastructure spend and how that informs your view longer term in terms of the outlook for the economy?
Well, it would really depend on the type of infrastructure, but generally you would expect quite a lot of it to be after the 5 years. And therefore, just looking at it from a different perspective is actually quite important.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much indeed. I believe you're sticking around. We'll get more questions to you after the break. Chief Economist at KPMG UK, Yael Selfin, staying with us. More markets next, of course, and we'll get more analysis, of course, in terms of the lead up to this UK budget. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
Season is here.
I think that this earnings season is going to be so important.
Bloomberg is first to break the numbers.
NVIDIA earnings now crossing the wire.
Bank of America, the retailer Five Below.
There is something for everybody.
With the smartest insights.
Weaker inflation is not great for earnings.
I think the consumer's a bit more resilient.
You've had earnings recessions flow through growth and then cyclicals and defensives.
Earnings cycle continues on Wall Street.
Continuing coverage on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. Today's CFOs are reshaping the C-suite. Bloomberg's chief future officer shines a spotlight on these dynamic leaders.
Our first job is to intimately understand and anticipate the consumer's needs.
It's an incredibly fun job, for sure. To me, teamwork is key.
You need to identify opportunities and push people.
It's not about how to say no, it's about how to say yes.
Their impact goes far beyond the balance sheet. And on Chief Future Officer, they focus on much more than just revenues and margins.
Today's CFO has to be much, much more than a bookkeeper. I talk more about culture today than I talk about numbers.
Competition's moving faster. The world is moving faster. It's a lot more than the profit today. It's building the future of tomorrow.
Get passion, perspective, and more from the Chief Future Officers of some of the world's most influential companies. New episodes this fall. Only on Bloomberg. Brought to you by Workday.
David Weston, join me for the next generation of Wall Street Week, telling stories of capitalism from business, markets, economics, tech, and climate. Each week, we'll go on the road for a look at what lies behind the headlines of today and what will likely be the headlines tomorrow.
Above all else is a mission.
Done nothing but grow immensely. To me, that's an extraordinary sign.
We can be the change that we want to see.
Watch the all-new Wall Street Week
More than what you need to know, it's what you need to think about. Bloomberg loves earnings.
I know it's like your Super Bowl,
I
right?
can't wait. It's like opening presents in the morning.
All right, it will be exciting.
Nobody covers earnings like Bloomberg.
Welcome back. Happy Monday. 30 minutes from the start of the opening trade. We know there's going to be volatility likely in the bond markets, particularly when it comes to US Treasuries. We've got data coming through. We've got the announcement on Wednesday in terms of the debt issuance out of the Treasury as well. So that will be consequential. But the here and now is the focus, of course, on the European debt markets and sovereign yields. And the sell-off is there. You can see it at the front end. You can see it towards the back end as well. The front end, French hopes, yields up 4 basis points at the front end at 3.08. So you're back above that 3% level at the front end when it comes to, in fact, that's the 10-year. I should say the back end when it comes to French debt. At the front end, it's more modest. You've got a yield move around 3 basis points on the front end, 238, 308 on the 10-year when it comes to French debt. When it comes to German debt, at the front end, the 2-year, 214, yields up 2 basis points. BTPs, of course, in Italy, 262 in terms of the move, yields up 2 basis points. So a bit of selling pressure coming through across these sovereign debt markets of Europe. The focus, of course, on France, given the warning that's come through from Moody's and the debt profile of that country, which we know is a concern for these ratings agencies. Talking about debt profiles, let's bring it back to the UK and bring in Yael Self in right now, Chief Economist at KPMG UK. We've been talking about the preview and the build-up to this budget. A lot has been flagged, a lot has been trailed by the Chancellor. Talk to us about the ability for the debt markets. We touched on this, but you don't think there's any risk at this point of a budget from Rachel Reeves that provokes the bond vigilantes here in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I think that with the change in the fiscal rules, she will probably have about 50 billion room to borrow, but she's unlikely to use all of that. Partially just because, as you said earlier, it takes time to build up the capacity to actually invest. So it's not that easy to do that fast. But also because she would probably want to pace things and not panic the markets. And therefore, if she wants to keep investment levels more or less at the same level as current levels as a share of the economy, she would probably want to spend around 25 billion, not more than that, 20 to 25 billion. I think that
is that to get to the 2.5%? Is it the 2.5% level?
The 2.4 levels, that is the same as at the current levels. You probably want to stick to that. It seems safe. It seems like stability. And that seems to be within the expectations of the market at the moment.
So you've got her changing the fiscal rules so she can borrow to invest, raising taxes so she can increase day-to-day spending, and promising not to return to austerity. But we don't really know what austerity means. What would she have to do to avoid being accused of returning to austerity?
It's a good question. So if you look at unprotected departments, the day-to-day spending there, if you don't want to cut that in real terms, you need to increase spending by about 16 billion. She may want to spend a little bit more than that because there's a few other things she wants to spend on. So we're thinking an envelope of around 20 billion. And that is a fair number, where there's been a few speculation as to how she would get there in terms of tax increases that would not completely shock the economy.
Well, how do your clients react to what they're expecting? Tom flagged this potential rise in national insurance contributions for employers. When you're talking to clients, are they packing their bags? Which bits of this potential budget are they worried about?
I think generally businesses would welcome stability and a growth prospect in the economy. You do need a functioning economy. For example, we do need to cut the waiting list in the NHS. There's a few things that need to be done, and I think businesses recognize that. So while if taxes go up but services, the quality of services is addressed as a result, I think most businesses would welcome it. It's just a question of how efficiently you do that, and there's quite a few things around it that I think the Chancellor is going to put in place.
When it comes to outside of the UK, though, it just feels like I'm going to bring back to the tax story, there's this race almost for who can have the highest taxes and who can juice the corporate or even the consumer the most. You're seeing it in France, you're seeing it in other parts of Europe as well, and certainly in the UK. Does that disincentivize investment when it comes to really any of these countries when they're all trying to compete?
Well, it's not in the US.
Well, it might be. We don't know that.
We don't know that.
Yeah.
But what happened to start with was, if you like, a race to increase public debt as a share of GDP. So that's really what triggered it. We are where we are, and that needs to be addressed.
Well, let's bring that to the deficit story then, right? I mean, we're looking at down the barrel of a U.S. election, of course, in 8 days. That even when we do get that result, doesn't get inaugurated, whoever that may be, until January 20th. We've got 10 days before that, a debt ceiling that's hit. What's the worst case scenario there? What actually happens when that debt ceiling is triggered? Does it have implications for the rest of the world?
I think there's more uncertainty, which is really what we don't want at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, but beyond that, the key thing for Europe, it seems, is the fear around tariff, is the fear around the trade relationships overall and supply chains and how they could be disrupted.
Yeah, on the BOE, when it comes to maybe a more fiscally expansionary budget from this Chancellor on Wednesday, does that make the BOE's job more difficult in terms of the pacing of rate cuts going into 2025?
Generally, I mean, we've seen relatively positive news on inflation in the UK. I'd say surprisingly, for most. And therefore, it would be very difficult for the BOE to become more hawkish than what it is at the moment. We would still expect at least another cut this year of 25 basis points.
Yeah. Okay, the markets are pricing about 40 basis points by the end of the year. Sub 4%, interestingly, by May, on the benchmark rate for the BOE. Does that align with your view as we project out into 2025, sub 4%?
Probably yes. Yes.
Okay,
I think so. Yeah, I mean, it is a little bit early to tell just because of the US story as well that could impact inflation and a few other things. But if things go to plan, if you like, I think we could see 3.5 by the end of next year.
Well, that in mind, you were talking about how well Rachel Reeves has communicated in the run-up to the budget. Do you think that actually, by contrast, the Bank of England's communications have been a bit all over the place? There's a divergence between Andrew Bailey and Hugh Pill.
Well, we're seeing slightly less communication by the BOE, which is probably better in that sense because there's less of that confliction. But overall, probably there is a little bit more room to be a bit clearer where the MPC as a whole, as a group, is.
Diplomatically put, yeah.
Very quickly, a final thought on the Fed, though, and when we're talking especially about deficits, tax rises, election risk, does this actively affect the rate path? I mean, there's a narrative out there that if you, regardless of where the deficit risk comes from, whether it's Trump or Kamala, it actively prices out the Federal Reserve. Do you buy that?
Well, I just think the US economy at the moment is probably quite strong, despite the labor market figures that we'll probably get later on this week, that will probably be a bit weaker just because of the storms and the strikes. Generally, the picture is relatively strong, and therefore you're probably likely to see less of a cut. So 25 basis points rather than the 50.
Into the end of the year.
Potentially.
All right. Chief economist at KPMG UK, Yale Self, just joining us to talk about a slew of other issues. We thank you so much from the economics to the markets, of course. Coming up, we're going to be joined by Thomas Hassler, CEO of Swiss Building Materials Group, Sika. What's the outlook for the construction sector next? We're having that conversation with Yale there. Tariffs, the economy, that strength has to show up in this particular sector. We're going to have that conversation next. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg.
prided myself, probably wrongly, having worked in many countries, been brought up as a child in the Middle East and in the Far East, having a mother who was not British, she was Hungarian, she was a survivor from Auschwitz, I was the son of a Holocaust survivor, and being involved with lots of people, I thought to myself, I know a lot about diversity, and I know about inclusion and not being included. But actually, when I came out, I realized that my level of understanding was not very high. And actually, I could see both the support and the rejection of being different, and what you had to do to live a life where you were different. And I'm immensely pleased that I was outed when I was 60, just under 60. Because had I not been outed, I probably would have said I could stay in the closet and still believe that I knew everything, which I didn't. And that was a very important moment for me.
Bloomberg Surveillance covers the latest in global markets and the political events that influence your world. Join Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
We are 18 minutes away from the opening trade. Futures pointing higher on both sides of the pond as we kick off the week. And let's focus in on a particular company story now. The buildings material group Sika reporting growth in profitability in their earnings on Friday. The company based out of Switzerland reported higher EBITDA, sales and gross profit for the first 9 months of 2024 and has also confirmed its full-year outlook. It's good now to be joined by the CEO, Thomas Hasler, around the table. Thomas, you're straight back from a trip to China, so it's the perfect opportunity to talk to you about the demand outlook there. I know that a lot of your products are made for the autos industry. Do you think, given what we were talking about when it came to VW, that the German car makers are going to be able to regain their footing in China?
I absolutely believe so, but it will make major efforts to do so. We're looking at the dynamics in China, the Chinese OEMs, they have good traction. But I would never give up on, let's say, on the European car makers and the Germans. But they have a bit, let's say, a catch-up to do, especially on the cost side, to be competitive in a very price-sensitive market in China.
I mean, until that point, can the revenue lost from autos be made up from other manufacturing industries like renewables?
I mean, yes, we have very strong demands on the renewable side. So, I mean, the wind, the solar, they are good contributors. But at the same time, we also have other manufacturing industry, the transportation industry, for instance. So, yes, it equals out to some degree, but not all of it.
Thomas, on the China story, I was speaking to the CEO of Philips earlier. They've downgraded their outlook, and that's largely as a result of the softness in China. Very different business, of course. But he said, so Roy Jacob, the CEO of Philips, said he does not see the impacts of China's stimulus yet. Are you seeing the impacts?
No, that's pretty similar. The stimulus are out there. They try very hard. We expect also on the construction side, on the infrastructure side, some significant spending, which will benefit us. But so far, it doesn't trigger down into real increased activities.
On that key unit around the autos market that Lizzie touched on in Europe, how bad does it get? When does that start to bottom out? What does the picture look like in 2025?
I think here the demand for cars in Europe is absolutely, let's say, there. We have a backlog. Consumers are confused about what to buy. The incentives are missing, so they're shying away from combustion engines, but at the same time, let's say, e-vehicles are too expensive. So we have a 16 million build rate in Europe, which normally should be at 22, 23 million. So we have a massive, let's say, backlog. The fleet is aging, but that comes at some point also to an end. So we shouldn't, let's say, confuse ourselves with the, let's say, underlying demand and, let's say, the short-term consumption which also next year probably will be soft given the uncertainties.
So if you have that backlog, then how long does that backlog take to clear? I mean, you talk going into next year, but could it go further?
I don't think so. I believe it will probably re-establish more solid demands next year. It will require some incentives. It will require some steering from the governments in regards to give clear guidance to the consumer what is preferred. This is missing at the moment.
You made a key point around subsidies and how so many of those have been rolled back in the likes of Germany, France, certainly here in the UK as well. It is starting to be something that might show up in the United States as well. Who makes up that gap? Where does that extra funding potentially come from, or does it just not?
I'm not a big fan of this subsidizing industry. So when I look at the US, I think in the US, the Infrastructure Act is an intelligent way to mobilize and bring momentum in. It is also visible. It has impact. The reshoring, as another example, these are, from my point of view, very smart incentive programs. Others are less effective. The European Green Deal is, let's say, diffused by too many legislations that have different directions to take. It's not so clear.
So 10% of your business, I think I'm going to circle back to where we started, is coming from China.
Mm-hmm.
8 years ago, we talked about this risk from the tariff perspective, the COVID perspective, as well has been folded into there, that kind of kickstarted this reshoring story and this friendshoring story. And yet it took companies, I want to say a couple of years before they actually actively acted on investing in countries and supply chains that were closer to home.
Yeah.
Do you see that accelerating or decelerating?
Oh, this is accelerating. This is very clear. I mean, we saw it.
But that's an expensive prospect if it's accelerating. Is there money for it to accelerate further?
I mean, this is spent on de-risking, and it's not only, let's say, reshoring into the US, but it has started several years back going into Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
We have seen many manufacturers moving into Vietnam, into Thailand. You know, this took place, and yes, of course, overall it is additional costs. But also you can't, let's say, just see this tension and this potential, let's say, global resetting and just be not active on it. So this definitely adds cost, but I think it is a momentum that increases. It would also happen in Europe, but Europe is a little bit in a limbo in this regards, that this reshoring is much less pronounced than in North America or in Southeast Asia.
How do you think about the competitive landscape in the US? Because, of course, it accounts for about 20% of your revenue. There's lots of potential there, but then how do you weigh that up against all of the market leaders trying to gain market share there?
I love the US market. It's a very competitive market. You have to be strong. We are strong. We have a strong position in the construction chemical market. We consider us leading. And as a leader, it's in your hand. You know, you define the direction. And therefore, yes, we are investing heavily in the US, in the footprint, in the expansion, also acquisition. You know, it's a beautiful market, but the winner takes it all. I love this mentality. In the US, we have a very strong organization, and our, let's say, second, third, and fourth are, well, quite a distance from
You've been really busy in terms of M&A over the past couple of years. What's guiding your M&A strategy over the coming months?
Yeah, well, coming months and years, it's very simple. Our M&A strategy is enhancing our organic growth. So any prospect that helps us to elevate from a level to the next and then accelerate the organic growth, that's attractive to us. It's a platform for growth.
What's the potential when it comes to data centers for you? What is the growth potential, the revenue stream potential of data streams 5-10 years out for your business?
I mean, this is an amazing, let's say, explosion of data centers. 8,000 data centers are going to be built at the moment in the next 5 years. This may even be too low, as data are, let's say, the mine or the gold of the future, and heavy investments. It started selectively in some countries, now it goes across the board. All countries, data centers are built, and for us, data centers are, let's say, high-end construction building. From one side, they need to be, let's say, totally, let's say, encapsulated, giving the freedom to operate without disruption. On one hand, on the other hand, also the decarbonization commitment of those data center owners requires that they walk the talk and also build more sustainable.
But the value of that market for you, What is the value of that data center market for you in the medium term?
I mean, this is one segment that is a very nice segment, but it is compared to infrastructure still, let's say, a smaller section.
Okay, super CEO Thomas Hassler, thank you very much indeed for joining us around the set. Guys, pretty interesting on geopolitics, on inflation, reshoring.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the creaking infrastructure around the world is something that makes Sika rub its hands because it's such an opportunity for their business. And as you say, data centers, what did Thomas say? An explosion of data centers coming around the world, again, makes them rub their hands because this is precisely feeding into their business.
To what extent, I wonder, though, is the prospect of tariffs from Trump, that a beautiful market could be tarnished by that, the build in America for America. You've seen that strategy at play when it comes to Western firms in China. Build in China for the Chinese market. I wonder if that becomes more of a theme if you get Trump in the White House.
And it's something that is arguably being priced into these markets. Of course, you're seeing in pieces of the FX market, not to mention the bond market as well. Let's get a little bit more perspective from that angle. Bloomberg's Rachel Evans, managing editor for FX and rates coverage for the U.S. and Europe, joins us around the table. You have an exciting 8 days ahead of you, as we all do. Walk us through that trade in the context of what we're hearing out of Japan, the oil markets. Where does the Trump trade exist?
Yeah, so I think there's a really big focus is going to be on US markets this week. So we're having kind of obviously the setup today, we're thinking more about Japan, we're thinking about the yen and dollar yen. But when we're looking kind of at the Trump trade, it's really kind of been in those US associated assets. So we're looking at the dollar. The dollar has been very kind of, I would say, volatile based off this idea of do you see kind of a Trump presidency that favors tariffs, which would be something that would be dollar supportive, or do you see something that actually creates so much volatility, perhaps around kind of a disputed election result, that the dollar is not its haven of choice. But when you then look around at kind of where the other havens of choice might be, you're looking now at the yen, and perhaps it's less stable there. So I think it's been really interesting kind of seeing that sort of setup coming into a week where people are going to be looking, or 2 weeks in fact, people are going to be looking for stability and for havens, that the yen is now really not one of those places that they might look. And I think there where we're really starting to talk much more about whether we see the re-establishment of the carry trade. It feels very much like we're kind of going back in time to 3 months ago, where we hadn't then seen the BOJ doing its second hike. We hadn't kind of seen some of this election instability come through, and we were actually sort of seeing kind of the yen very, very weak. We're now back to those levels, which starts to bring intervention back into the playbook. So it may be already kind of a stressful 10 days ahead, and it feels like it's about to get more stressful.
So the yen is down 6/10% versus the US dollar at 153. It's paired some of the heavier losses of the session. What is that intervention level for you? What is the level you're looking at then?
Yeah, so like 157 to 160 was kind of where they were intervening earlier this year. We're at, as you say, kind of around 153. So we've got a ways to go, but the fact that we have now kind of retraced all of those gains that we saw kind of after that last BOJ hike, and when we saw the big unwind and carry, to me suggests that we're going to start to see people establishing new positions, new short positions. And indeed, we did see that last week, kind of heading into the election. Hedge funds switched to being kind of bearish on the yen for the first time in a month.
And indeed, Nasdaq futures up 0.6% this morning. I just want to come to oil finally because of the developments in the Middle East. Citi downgrading the Brent forecast to $60 a barrel. How much further downside do you see, especially when you factor in the China story, the downside risk there?
Yeah, I mean, oil is always kind of this question of supply and demand, right? And I think a lot of the fundamentals for oil are pretty negative at the moment. You have the potential for OPEC to be pumping more, so they're bringing a lot more supply into the market. And then, as you point out, you've got that demand picture. And I always like to look at kind of commodity currencies when thinking about sort of oil. And sort of seeing today, it was really very little shift. So I think what you've kind of seen in sort of the Middle East developments is some of the noise being taken out of the market. And that means people are really going to focus on those fundamentals. And as you point out, those fundamentals aren't great. So I think it remains to be seen quite how much further we could go down, but clearly down is where we're headed.
All right, Bloomberg's Rachel Evans, managing editor for FX and rates coverage for the US and EMEA, as we're looking at Brent trading down 4% at $72 a barrel, Chrissy.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating that she's talking about the yen, she's talking about oil, and for me, they're almost connected in that. Of course, we're talking about the inflation and the tax changes that may happen if Toshiba is able to actually push through some of those policy changes, but then the fact that the oil moves are actually major import costs for Japan as well, not to mention, of course, for the United States, and that's coming down. That's a positive ahead of the U.S. election.
On the inflation story, and the inflation was a key gripe, it seems, for voters, as well as the scandals, inflation, and how that informs policy making going forward. There's plenty more coming up, of course. The Open countdown is on. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, Monday on Bloomberg. Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything. The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
We don't know what the policy reaction function is actually going to be off of what has been said. And for that reason, I think you have a number of investors that are actually just sort of continuing to plow forward on the view that the economy is in pretty good shape. So that when there is an election outcome, once there's a sense for whether new policy will actually get affected, then they can have a reaction.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
There is this real momentum from Wall Street. We are basically deep in the European earnings season.
Take a look at how we're faring when it comes to Asian markets.
Don't start your trading day on Bloomberg Open Interest.
2 hours of single stock stories that are driving the opening bell action. We'll take you to Wall Street, Main Street, the C-suite, and beyond.
These are companies that are growing their market.
Great companies in the U.S. are the companies hitting the cutting edge. That's a different story.
Get the inside track on what's buzzing in markets.
With the players who are shaping the narrative.
If you have bad earnings reports, you're going to get punished.
They're not buying what the industry is selling. Join us on Bloomberg Open Interest. Weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern, only on Bloomberg.
Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
A lot of things we've done which I think are bad, whether you're Democrat or Republican, or you support, they're often done in the name of good, have hurt the lower 20%. They're dying younger, their incomes didn't go up for 20 years. They're the ones who have more crime in neighborhoods, their schools don't work. I think we have to be very clear-headed about how we can accomplish what we want to accomplish to lift up all of America.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Less than 2 minutes until the opening trades across Europe. We are counting down to maybe some of the major individual stock moves, but from a very broad basis. Let's talk about where we went on Friday's trade. Of course, the stock 600 ending a little bit higher, but only for the United States to end on a negative close. How does that then affect what we're seeing in the futures picture and whether or not that risk sentiment ahead of a very consequential week in Europe? How does that start to shape up on this Monday morning, Tom?
Futures pointing to a positive session this Monday in Europe, up 0.6%. We'll pass what's going on, of course, in terms of the read across from Japan. A big earnings week, of course. We'll pick that for you, unpick that for you. Phillips may be in focus for us. European futures then pointing again 0.6%. The FTSE 100 stuck really between the strength that's coming through for iron ore, the softness in the oil price, currently pointing up by just 0.1%. Over in France, the CAC looking to gain 48 points.
Well, just zooming in on some of the stocks that may be on the move at the open, Tom, you've got the oil stocks very much in focus, given that Brent is down after that Israel strike on Iran avoided oil facilities. So mind the likes of BP and Shell. We'll also keep an eye on VW after that news over the weekend that its board has drawn up cost-cutting plans, looking to save €4 billion. If there were a red flag for the German economy, this is it. To what extent does that weigh on the DAX? We've also, of course, had the Philips earnings cutting their annual sales outlook on the weak demand from China. Tom, you were speaking to the CEO, Roy Jacobs, this morning. We'll keep an eye on those shares after their results as well, Critty.
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating one as well. When we talk about what is actually making up this buildup, Tom was specifically talking about that 0.6% gain that you saw in the French markets. What is that in reaction to? Is that ultimately something that's getting pared back? Remember on Friday, France was downgraded to a negative watch over by one of the ratings agencies. So, of course, that's going to be the first time we're going to see that getting priced into the equity kind of picture. We are waiting, of course, for that early pricing as well. And as we figure that out, of course, we are going to really keep an eye on those individual stocks. Tom, I'm going to get straight to you and see how some of these individual markets are trading. Tom.
All right, let's check in on markets right now. The FTSE 100 currently up just 0.1% across these markets. The Stock 600 posting gains of 0.2%, so slightly more modest upside that's come through than had been flagged by the futures. But of course, that continues to evolve as these main indexes open at just shy of 8:01 this Monday morning. The French CAC 40 gaining 0.6%, as was flagged by the futures. FTSE Mid over in Italy also up 0.6%, and over in Spain a similar picture as well. Across your sectors, top of the list so far, travel and leisure gaining a full 1%. Autos, interestingly, getting 0.9% of a boost. One sector in negative territory, no big surprise here, is energy, down 1.4.
We are, it looks like, still waiting for the DAX to open, but if we just zoom in on some of these individual movers, as I said, to keep an eye on the energy, the stocks, you've got BP lower 0.2%, Shell lower 1.4% currently. We're still waiting for Philips to start trading, but it looks like VW is currently not open. We've got all but one sector in the green this morning, as you say, travel and leisure leading the gains higher 0.9%. Energy, the only one in the red, lower 1.2% currently. And we're still, on my screen, it seems, waiting for the DAX to open.
We certainly are keeping a close eye on those automakers as well. I think you already mentioned this, but Philips shares are, of course, halted in Amsterdam trading. That's another one we're going to keep an eye on. You just interviewed the CEO as well around their China outlook.
Yeah, look, this is something that's rippling across the European equity space right now. In fact, Barclays has a basket of those companies that have exposure to what is happening in China. We've seen this with the luxury makers, the luxury goods makers. We've seen this with the automakers. And now we're seeing with this key maker, of course, of health devices, Philips. And they cut their outlook for the year. And that was almost entirely down to the softness that they're seeing in China. And when I asked the CEO stimulus and whether he's seeing an impact, the answer was no, not yet. A lack of visibility when it comes to the Chinese markets that they project into 2025. And that is a story that is not unique to Philips. Right, let's bring in, on this point then, and a view more broadly on these markets, Karen Tiddy, BlackRock's head of EMEA Investment Strategy. Karen, drum rolls leading up to your entrance there. Thanks for joining us around the studio. We appreciate it, bright and early on a Monday. What for you is most important across these markets this week? Is it the earnings story? Is it central banks? Is it the politics of Japan? Is it the Middle East? What are these catalysts for you as front and centre?
So for me, three things, and it's a mixture of everything you said. Of course, the central banks matter, and for that, I'm looking to the non-farm payrolls number on Friday. I'm also looking to the PCE releases. You know, we want to see how that macro picture is looking. If we look at the recent indicators, the US macroeconomic data has been surprising on the upside, and we've even seen a pickup in some of the forward-looking components of the economy, like the new orders component. And this is really interesting, considering that the market pricing for the Fed rate path has been pricing out some of those rate cuts. You know, we've got only a cut and a half priced in by end of this year. So this week, macro data will matter a lot for the central bank.
Where is your view on pricing around the Fed at this point?
So when we look at the year, and obviously we started super dovish 7 cuts price, and then you know, we've had one jumbo cut, but then we haven't had we've had the pricing become a lot more hawkish throughout the year. I think right now the pricing has become a little bit more fair when we look at that 1.5 cut by year end. I think if you look at December, 60% probability for 25 basis point cut, that seems a bit more fair than having been in the past few weeks at a point where a 50 basis point chance was being pressed.
Talk to us a little bit then about how you actually hedge all of this. And it feels like the narrative has been a very easy go long ball, because that's the only thing you can really be certain of. Are there other pockets that could be a worthy hedge?
Absolutely. So when we look at that hedge conversation, obviously you've had this environment where the S&P has not been far from all-time highs and has reached new all-time highs at the same time that the VIX, that implied volatility fear gauge index remains elevated at 18 or so. So there's that VIX premium priced in, and then you look at the rate volatility, and rate volatility is also high. So to your point, that vol hedging through options is something that remains popular, but I would also look at gold. If I look at the global ETF flow picture, October gave us $4 billion into gold ETFs, which is the highest month on record. And even though gold has hit all-time highs, I think we still see a lot of investors look to gold as a diversification hedge in this environment.
It has, and you can see that, of course, to your point, show up in the gold ETF, GLD, of course. Handy dandy put up that data on my terminal. But talk us through the valuation story there, because the argument against gold is that that's really a hedge against inflation or even against the deficit as well. If you get a Harris presidency and the deficit isn't as much of a concern, or if you have, say, the China story continuing to weigh in onto gold, suddenly this 27, almost 2,800 that you're seeing on the precious metal looks very, very pricey. Why would you buy into that right now?
So I would look at it a little bit differently to the thesis that you laid out. So when we look at the gold's drivers over the past year and a half, and it has been going higher and higher, its correlation to things like the dollar, the real rate has broken down. And a lot of it has come down to the steady buying from emerging market central banks. But then you look at the flow data, again, the global ETP flow data since May, and those have increased in lockstep month after month. What this tells me is that the buyers of gold have become more diversified as the investment community joins in on the buying trend. And then when I consider that gold is a non-yielding asset and that rates yields are indeed coming down, even if they're not coming down as quickly as in previous rate cutting cycles, that also reduces the opportunity cost of holding gold, which is a positive.
Kareem, I want to bring it to the UK because, of course, we've got the budget on Wednesday. It could be a fundamental redrawing of the UK economy. We've talked a lot about the gilt story, but how are you positioning in terms of stocks going into it?
So we've been evolving our tactical asset allocation views on UK assets a little bit over the past few weeks. We remain overweight on UK equities with a focus on the FTSE 100. So this is very much a large cap story, although I do think there's also a lot of opportunities in small and mid, but through active investing. So FTSE 100 more through an ETF approach, and then through an active investing approach for the small and mid. We have moderated this overweight a little bit in favor of the gilts. Why? Because when we think about that market pricing for the rate path for the BOE, it looks the least dovish across all the major central banks, across Fed, ECB, and BOE. But the UK economy, it maybe is not super weak, but it is coming down from that point of strength a little bit. It's still supportive, but it's coming down. And so that market pricing for the BOE leaves room to own duration there in gilts.
Okay, so, where Andrew Bailey's talking about aggressive policy potentially ahead, but Hugh Pill a little bit more hawkish, where do you expect the rate path to actually go? Which of them is right?
Well, I look at it in the context of the market pricing, and the market pricing for the BOE looking to year-end and also to 2025 is actually more hawkish than that of the Fed. So when I think of it in the context of the UK economy versus the US economy, is that justified? I don't think so, which is why I look at a more positive duration view for gilts.
What do you think? How convinced are you about the broadening theme that we're seeing when it comes to US stocks away from Mag 7? We've got the earnings story, of course, this week, which will be illustrated for us, 5 to 7 reporting. And since the peak in July, it's actually the weakest sector, if you put it as a sector, Mag 7 versus things like utilities perform very well. Does that, as a theme, continue? How convinced are you that pushes into 2025?
Yeah, so if I zoom out and I look at Q3 of 2024 relative to the prior 2 quarters, one big theme for us in equities, where we have remained overweight US equities throughout the year, is that breadth theme. So the S&P equal weight index, which I look at to measure that breadth theme versus just the S&P market cap 500, that S&P equal weight index has outperformed throughout Q3. It's also seen flows. I always love talking about global ETF flows, but we've also seen flows into that.
Does that continue?
Tracker. And yes, so forward looking, we do see that breadth continuing because we are seeing it come through in the earnings numbers. When we look at 2024 earnings, we are tracking double-digit growth in earnings, but with a lot more participation of various sectors, utilities, healthcare, not just tech. So more broad than last year.
What is not getting enough love right now when it comes to the bond market? What is the undiscovered gem?
In bonds, I think when we look at
Radio Lab is brought to you by Progressive
two
Insurance.
things. When
Do
we
you
look
ever
at the
think about
yield
switching insurance companies to see if you can save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you can save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Listener supported. WNYC Studios.
Wait, you're listening?
You're listening to Radio Lab.
Radio Lab.
From
WNYC.
Hey, oh, I'm ready to go. Let's go.
This is Radio Lab. I'm Latif Nasser.
Good.
And I'm Annie McEwen.
Oh, I'm gonna be in the thing. I'm gonna be at
Yeah,
the top.
sure, why not?
And I'm
Sure.
Annie McEwen.
And you might be wondering why you're here, Annie McEwen.
I thought this was the bathroom. What am I doing here?
Well, I needed help. I needed a companion for
Okay,
this
Lulu's
piece.
out.
Lulu's out, still on maternity leave, and I wanted you here for this story because you and we are both Canadians, and I wanted to do a story that is not about Canada, but about something essential to this country, the United States. And I just thought there's a value to you and I not being from here in this foreign land.
Like we're aliens staring out of the cockpit of our UFOs at the new land in front of us and observing. We're anthropologists.
Yeah,
We're
very polite anthropologists.
okay.
And so, if we could, I would like for us to turn our Canadian eyes to the U.S. presidential election.
This election is close. Everyone knows that. But what?
And so, so maybe my first question is just, what do you think about when you think about an American election?
The circus. The carnival.
So put on Pavarotti singing Ave Maria. Nice and loud.
Or sort of a grotesque carnival type thing. That is just like, so confusing. I'm just like in awe of how complicated it is.
Yeah, that's the thing. When I first got here, the way this country picked president felt to me like
Here we've got our reds, we've got our blues,
a giant
we've got our toss-ups.
Rube Goldberg machine with all kinds of, it's like,
Take a look at this. This is her big blue firewall.
if Pennsylvania goes blue, 8 doors open up,
Flip back the blue wall.
and a marble hits Michigan, and a mousetrap falls on Wisconsin.
So that's her clearest path to victory, but she's got several paths.
Or how about,
Say Harris loses Georgia.
well,
Guess what?
look out for North Carolina.
You come over now to the Sun Belt battleground state.
Which means then you really need to pay attention to Nevada and Arizona.
Well, those are very, very swingy states that are very much in play for both campaigns right now.
And it's sort of just like, how? Like, one of, if not the most important election in the world. How is this the system? Like, just the system seems so arbitrary and confusing. It's always seemed so arbitrary and confusing until I heard this story.
Oh.
This story, for me, felt like it explained so much about how Americans picked their president and why. But also that it didn't necessarily have to be this way. And there was one moment, not like much more recent than I expected. There was one moment where it all could have been a lot simpler. And it almost was a lot simpler.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi. How are you?
And it's a story I first heard. Good. How are you?
I'm good. Sorry, we're a little, as usual, slightly frantic here.
From my friend and mentor, Harvard historian Jill Lepore. So the story starts with a guy,
And I kind of love this guy.
Birch By.
I especially love him because of his jingle. Hey, look him over.
He's my kind of guy. His first name is Birch. His last name is
What?
By. He was a U.S. senator.
From Indiana. Like a very wholesome looking kind of corn-fed guy.
Has done before so hey, look.
Very handsome, charming, dimples, blue-eyed young guy.
Like a John F. Kennedy manqué, as they would say.
He literally gets called the Kennedy of the Midwest.
Please join me in a warm welcome for the Democratic Senator from Indiana, Birch Bayh.
And
Thank you very much.
he was very ambitious.
I think we have a responsibility to see
Very, very ambitious.
that this country is today and will be for future generations. What Abraham Lincoln described as the one last best hope. It's a rather significant responsibility. It's ours, yours and mine. And I hope we don't shirk it.
So he's elected to the Senate in 1962, takes office in 1963.
And when he gets there,
He's one of the youngest members of the Senate.
He's still wet behind the ears.
Yeah, he's 34 years old.
so Birch died in 2019, but we were able to talk to two of his former staffers.
I'm Jay Berman. At one point, I was a legislative assistant to Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana. At another point, I was the chief of staff.
And my name is Bob Blameyer. I spent the first 13 years of my adult life, starting as a freshman in college, working for Senator Birch Bayh.
So a couple things to know about Birch. One,
Birch had an ice cream addiction.
He loved ice cream.
Which was bane in my existence for many years
Why?
later.
Wait, why?
Because you're always on a tight schedule, and he was at Dairy Queen, and we had to go there. He carried a spoon in his briefcase. Seriously.
And then the other thing, which we already mentioned, he was really ambitious.
But he was a problem solver. He would see something that needed to be fixed and go after it.
And when he gets to the Senate in 1963, he immediately has a problem. It's a kind of petty personal problem, but he is put on the Judiciary Committee because he'd gone to law school. But as a junior member, he doesn't get to chair a subcommittee, which sounds like who cares.
Sounds very boring. But
sounds
that's
very
what
boring.
people want?
Yeah, because that's how you actually get a little slice of power in Congress and how you can actually do things.
Okay.
Well, what happens is there was a subcommittee on constitutional amendments.
And it was kind of a dud of a committee.
Didn't do a lot of work.
It was known as the graveyard where proposed amendments go to die. But the chair of the subcommittee suddenly dies.
So the guy in charge of all the subcommittees is like, all right, I'm going to shut it down. We're just like spending money on this thing. It's pointless. But Birch, when he finds out about this, he goes straight to the guy in charge and he's like,
Hey, don't worry about these budgetary concerns. I'll finance the committee out of my own Senate office budget.
and Birch is just telling him like, hey, come on.
It's available now.
Nobody wants it.
Let me have it.
I need something to play with.
Because he's just looking for something to grab onto.
Yeah, he doesn't have like a big plan for the Constitution. He's not that guy.
But he's a charmer. So eventually the guy said, sure, Birch, you can have it.
And it changed his life, and it changed our country.
Because 2 months later, bang.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News.
November 22nd, 1963.
3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas.
John F. Kennedy is shot and killed.
Vice President Johnson will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
2 weeks later in the New York Times, there's an article with the headline, Succession Problem.
About how the terrible assassination of President Kennedy raised an issue of what if a president became disabled?
Because Kennedy...
He didn't die immediately.
What if he'd gone into a coma or been brain dead?
So disabled that he could not have carried out the duties of the president.
Duties that could include the power to launch nuclear weapons.
There was nothing in the Constitution on this.
People are like, shoot, we don't have a plan for this.
Which was a problem. But there's Birch,
the chairman of the subcommittee on constitutional amendments.
And this seems like a constitution level problem.
Let's fix it. We got a problem, let's fix it.
But
another problem, passing a constitutional amendment is like the hardest thing you can do as a politician.
Because you're required to get 2/3 of the House,
2/3 of the Senate,
and 3/4 of the state legislatures.
All of them.
Not an easy thing to do.
But Birch,
he took that as a challenge.
And he's got dimples.
He's got charisma.
Unbelievable political skills.
And one of the things he did, he went to the American Bar Association.
He pulled in lawyers, political scientists.
To try to build a coalition.
To get nonpartisan support behind him so he can take this amendment, go to both parties and say
it's just logical.
This amendment is
Simple.
Easy. It's kind of a no-brainer amendment.
we've got a problem.
Let's fix it.
So he takes his amendment, he goes to the House, the Senate, all the state legislators.
And overwhelmingly,
it passes.
Yay!
A whole brand new amendment to the Constitution.
And that is the 25th Amendment, presidential inability and succession.
Now, the kind of interesting thing is that if you have you heard of the 25th Amendment before?
No.
No. Okay. So
We're calling on Vice President Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment.
it came up a lot during both the Trump presidency and
Reportedly calling on Biden's cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment,
it has come up a lot during the Biden presidency.
which would possibly remove him from office.
Of like, oh, look at this guy, he's so old and he's so irrational and and we should use the 25th Amendment to unseat this guy or whatever, right? Like it's a sort of political weapon now, right? But initially it was not supposed to be that. It was not political, it was just practical.
Writing the 25th Amendment to the Constitution is one of the ways I have been able to serve both Indiana and the nation.
And for Birch, this young, ambitious guy, like, this is a huge deal. Like a founding father level achievement. He's still in his 30s.
Birch 5. What's his theme song?
Hey, look him over.
He's just singing it to himself in the graveyard.
That's right.
Check me out.
Okay, so he passes this constitutional amendment. And Jill says, because it's so hard to pass an amendment.
Once one happens, people are like, oh, I forgot you can amend the Constitution.
And all of a sudden, it's like a window opens.
And this burst of amendment activity.
And suddenly, Birch's graveyard became like a dance club that everybody wanted to get in, and he's the bouncer. You know what I mean?
was thinking like Candyland.
Yeah. He's the candy man, and everyone wants him to Candyland.
I
Yeah.
sort of feel like he's more of a candy guy than a dance club guy.
Sure,
Okay.
fair. But yeah, so all of these people are coming to Birch with these ideas for what they want to see in the Constitution, including the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson.
And he says, well, you just passed the Constitution Amendment. We'd like you to be the sponsor of one that we want, which is to eliminate what we call the faithless elector.
Faithless elector?
Faithless elector.
Like without religion?
No. But, okay, so here we are actually finally getting to the thing of electing a president.
Okay.
Wait, so most people don't actually realize this, but when you vote for the president of the United States, you're not actually voting for the president of the United States. You're voting for someone who then votes for the president of the United States.
Oh.
So those people are called electors. And basically how this goes is, like, you vote in your state has a certain number of these electors, and then the electors take a pledge to vote for the candidate who got the most votes in your state.
But a pledge is a pledge, and it could be broken.
In the history of U.S. presidential elections, approximately 156 electors have broken that pledge and either not voted or have voted for a different candidate, essentially have acted as faithless electors. And Johnson, for a lot of reasons, just thought, okay, this is a problem. And Birch, you're a problem solver.
So we'd like you to eliminate electors, and therefore the prospect of a faithless elector.
And Birch said,
sure, I'll introduce it as a constitutional amendment. But what happened?
What happened was, once Birch started holding these hearings on faithless electors, he started learning more and more about the Electoral College, about how it came to be, about why we still had it. And the more he learned, the more he became sort of radicalized, convinced that this system, the Electoral College,
that it's a ticking time bomb.
And that somebody had to stop it. That's coming up after the break. Radio Lab is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Radiolab is supported by BetterHelp. Masks and disguises are big this time of year, with many of us out shopping for that perfect Halloween costume. But do you ever feel like you wear a mask maybe more often than you want to in life? In your relationships, in the workplace, or in a social setting? Well, therapy can help you to learn to accept all parts of yourself so you can take the mask off. After all, masks should be for Halloween fun, not for our emotions. So, if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Therapy can arm you with the tools you need to live your best life, helping you learn things like positive coping mechanisms and setting effective boundaries. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Visit BetterHelp.com/Radiolab to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Radiolab.
The 2024 election is upon us, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But the outcome might not be clear till long after everyone has voted. If the race ends up being as close as it looks right now, we could be in for a repeat, or worse, of the year 2000. When the presidency came down to a recount in Florida that ended at the Supreme Court. To hear the whole story, check out Fiasco, Bush v. Gore, a podcast from the co-creators of Slow Burn. Listen on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Latif,
Annie.
Radio Lab. Okay, before we get going, I'm curious, what do you as a Canadian here on a visa, what do you know about the Electoral College?
Okay, well, I guess when I first got here, I thought this is probably a school you go to when you want to become president.
It's a college. It is.
Yeah.
That was
Ivy
my
League,
first
probably.
question about it. Why is it called college? But you know what it is? It's like, so the use of the word college here, this is a total tangent. It's college, like, you know how they have like the College of Cardinals or the College of Surgeons or whatever. It's like college is just like, the meaning is just a group of people.
Oh, like a pod of whales.
It's like a pod of whales. Yes, exactly. Okay, so we left off. Birch Bayh is now focusing his problem-solving gaze on the Electoral College. He's having these committee hearings, and he's learning, right, why it exists, what it does, how it works. And so I think for us to be able to understand why all of this radicalizes him, we have to learn what he learned. We have to go back and understand the Electoral College.
Okay,
So let's go. Let's go all the way to the beginning to explain.
Oh, I thought we had started, but it sounds like we haven't even started yet.
No, we haven't even started.
Amazing.
It's so wonky, but we're ready. You have me. I'm your Candyman.
I'll follow you anywhere.
Okay. All right. So here we go. So here we are in the Candyland that is Philadelphia, 1787, the Constitutional Convention. And founding fathers are like, we're starting this new country, we're very excited about it. The thing we can all agree on is we do not want a king. But we do kind of need someone to be in charge, so we're gonna have this person called president.
But how are we gonna choose the president?
That would require some thought.
Can I pause and take a little sip of Coke here?
Yeah, of course. Go for it. By the way, this is Alex Kesar. Also, I should say, even in our first conversation, when I was talking to Jill,
So there's a great book by Alex Kesar called Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College?
she brought you up. And then basically every other interview we've done for this story, people have brought you up.
That's what I tried to do in that book.
So he wrote the book, Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College? And he's also a professor of history
and social policy at Harvard University.
But, okay.
So anyway, they couldn't agree on a method of choosing the president.
And so there are some ideas on the table.
One idea was, well, we just came up with Congress.
All right, well, Congress should just elect the president.
But that's a bad idea. Then you lose separation of powers and checks and balances.
Then the president would be answerable to Congress. Like, when he runs for re-election, he needs to have their favor. That's stupid. We can't do that. That's a dumb idea. Thanks very much.
So someone else in the room says, Well,
What about the people? And everyone's like, no, can't do that.
Look, how is Farmer Johnson in a distant county
gonna know about some guy in Virginia running for president.
It's 1787. People didn't know anybody beyond their own neighborhood or town.
So, what they decided to do
was to take a break for a week.
They just left Philadelphia.
George Washington went fishing for the week.
What?
And they left behind a committee called, and you'll like this, it was called the Committee on Unfinished Parts.
I kind of love that.
Right? Okay, so these founders, most of whom you never heard of, weeks later, they are still stuck there in Philadelphia.
All the cool guys are fishing.
All the cool guys are out fishing and doing other stuff, and they have to figure this out.
To get this thing done, they wanted to get it sent to the states.
So they're like, okay, how do we do this? How do we pick a president? How do we do this? And then they figured it out. They were like, okay, how about we just copy-paste Congress?
What does that mean?
Well,
How do you copy paste?
Right.
Like just plagiarize?
No, they're not going to plagiarize.
Okay.
They're just like, okay, we know everybody's already agreed on Congress, right? There's been a lot of debate, a lot of arguing, but what they did to make a government that everybody agreed on, to make Congress, is they started putting thumbs on scales for different groups of people.
Thumb on a scale. Go over it.
Okay, so one of the thumbs is they make the Senate. And they say every state, doesn't matter if you're big or small, you get 2 senators. And so that's a little thumb on the scale for the small states that don't have a lot of people in them, so that they aren't completely overrun by the big states.
Okay.
The other thumb is for the South. They say, okay, you can count an enslaved person in your state as 3/5 of a person. That way you boost the population of your state and you get more representatives in the House. That was another thumb. To give more power to the South so they weren't overrun by the North.
You can imagine them sitting there, okay, so how do we choose a president? Well, do big states have more influence than small states? And, what about slaves? And then we're going to reopen that whole thing? No, we're going to import the whole thing. So what the Electoral College is in some respects a replica of Congress. If you think about it, each state has electors equal to the number of representatives plus the number of senators, okay? And then the electors would convene in their state capitals and cast their electoral votes.
And so the committee's like, bingo, job done.
So that sort of seems smart to me.
It is, under the circumstances, very clever solution.
Yeah.
So that also is stuff they put in the Constitution, right? So it's like, there's this body of electors that vote for the president. Each state has a certain number of electors based on how many representatives they have in Congress. All of that is in the Constitution. What is not in the Constitution is how to convert the people's votes in the state into electoral votes. Do you do it proportionally?
Where if you get 53% of these states vote,
you get 53% of the electoral vote.
Right.
Or you could do it by district. Each district in the state gets an electoral vote. But ultimately, the founders are like, we're going to let the states decide.
That makes sense. That's like an important part of this country is that the states
That
are
is an important part
making
of this
big
country,
decisions.
yeah.
So
True. But that might be the biggest mistake they made in this whole process.
So basically...
And Alex says there is this pivotal moment pretty early on where the system we now have starts to really take shape.
In the 1800 election.
Between these two sort of juggernauts in the history of this country, Adams and Jefferson.
Now, they have also run against each other in 1796.
And in that election, which Adams won...
Adams had gotten an electoral vote from the state of Virginia, Jefferson State.
Because Virginia was doing district voting. Adams had won a district, so we got a vote.
But in 1800, the Virginia legislature didn't want that to happen again. They saw a close election coming.
And so, the Virginia politicians got together and passed a state law that said, okay, we're done with this district system. From now on, the way our electors will vote will be...
winner take all.
If you win the majority of the votes in this state, all of our electors will cast their votes for you. And the Virginia politicians, they did this because they knew Jefferson was going to win a majority of votes in their state, and this way he wouldn't leave any on the table.
It's a little dirty.
A little dirty.
I don't know, something's a little smelly.
Yeah, the candy's gone smelly.
Yeah.
Because what they're doing is erasing all of the votes of the people who voted for Adams.
Yeah, no, exactly. And what's interesting when you look into the documents of it is they passed that law and then they attached to it a kind of apology for doing it.
Effectively saying,
We know this isn't really good or fair.
we know it would be better for the country if we did not do this, but we're doing it anyway.
So if the Virginia did this, shockingly, Massachusetts, John Adams' state, retaliated and did a version of the same thing.
And Alex says, after that, the states,
They're off to the races.
another state does it, then another state does it, and this is basically what the system is now. And what that system leads to is the feeling that your vote just doesn't actually matter. Because, like, if you vote for someone for president and then 50% plus one people in your state vote for someone else, your vote doesn't get counted. Like, for president, it means it's
Thrown out.
It's effectively thrown out. And that is essentially happening to tens of millions of votes every presidential election.
Right. Are you gonna make us feel better about voting by the end of this? Or
I think so.
It is with pleasure that I introduce Senator Birch Bach.
Because I kind of think of Birch and what he was trying to do as a sort of beacon of hope.
Thank you very much, Mark. Members of the faculty and student body of UCLA, it's a privilege for me to have the chance to be here with you this afternoon and to share some of my thoughts.
So when Birch started holding those hearings in the mid-60s on faithless electors, he's having all these different experts come in and testify about the whole history of the Electoral College, the fact that it wipes away all these people's votes, all different kinds of things. But one of the things that these experts hit on over and over is that the system is actually fundamentally dangerous.
You may say, well, why is it dangerous? Well, basically, it's dangerous. The most dangerous aspect of it is the fact that the present system, the Electoral College system, does not guarantee that the man who wins is the man that has the most votes.
And Alex says that's because when you have this winner-take-all system,
It transforms the contest into a contest among states. Because once you have winner-take-all, then winning the state really matters.
winning as many people as you can doesn't.
And because of this, the political leaders of both of our major parties know
You can lose the popular vote in the election,
it doesn't make any difference if you're soundly defeated,
so long as you win the right states.
you're going to have enough electoral votes to be elected President of the United States.
And this had almost just happened.
In 1960 was one of those very close elections where if I think it was 20 or 30,000 votes had gone differently in a few states,
The loser of the popular vote.
would have won because of the Electoral College.
And this is the thing that all the experts were saying was dangerous, which was the very thing that terrified Birch.
Because we think of the United States as in a particularly fragile moment historically right now, but that was also the case in the 1960s.
So remember, in 63,
3 shots were fired at
President Kennedy gets shot and killed.
It's the height of the Cold War. There's continued racial unrest and police brutality. By 68,
The peak of the war in Vietnam.
The whole world is watching. Chance to crown on this slide.
There's a protest at the Democratic National Convention.
violence on the streets.
Dr. Martin Luther King.
MLK Jr. is assassinated.
Shot to death.
Robert Kennedy. So Birch, he's watching all of this unfold.
And he's just really worried.
When we have an Electoral College system,
That if we have a system that can take the loser and make them a winner,
we tend to erode the confidence in the people of this country, in their president, and in their form of government.
That is his huge concern. That at some point in the future, Americans will refuse to recognize the legitimacy of a president.
and so once he came out of these committee hearings, learning what he did about the Electoral College,
Because you know what we need to do? We need to get rid of it. We don't need to tinker with it. We need to get rid of it.
Yes, it should be one person, one vote.
the direct popular election of the president.
One person, one vote. It's the only plan that guarantees you that the candidate with the most votes will win.
And from this point forward,
He devoted himself to this cause.
to take the Electoral College and burn it to the ground. That's coming up after a short break. Radiolab is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today? Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates, not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
I'm Al Letson, host of Reveal. From central Mexico to the front lines of Ukraine.
We were given an order not to take any prisoners.
From an abortion clinic in Florida.
A woman was just assaulted.
To the streets of Chicago.
More than 2,000 kilograms of heroin came to Chicago.
Reveal is your weekly dose of investigative reporting.
Somebody has to say something.
Subscribe to Reveal wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay, Latif.
Annie.
Radiolab.
Back from break.
Back from break. Can I tell you another fun fact about the Electoral College?
Latif, I would like nothing more.
Okay, so take a guess, okay?
Okay.
What is the least amount of the popular vote? What is the least percentage of the country that could vote for you where you could still win the Electoral College?
49%.
So you think 49% of people have to vote for you to win the Electoral College?
40%. No,
40%?
I don't know. I mean, nothing makes sense. I mean, like, yes, I would say 40-something.
23%.
Wow.
So if you get 50% plus 1 in all the smallest states,
yeah,
you could conceivably get 23% of Americans' votes and become the president.
That is shocking.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Okay, so 23%, that would be, like, that has never happened.
Okay.
What has happened 5 times in the history of this country, a candidate has lost the popular vote, but won the electoral vote and become the president. And
so crazy.
Besides those 5 times, it nearly happened in 1960. It nearly happened again in 1968. And so that year, 1968, Birch Bayh thinks now is the time to launch this amendment to abolish the Electoral College.
And having just done the 25th, he had some sense of it.
And Jay, his chief of staff, said, step 1,
build a coalition.
And so,
Please join me in a warm welcome for the Democratic senator from Indiana.
He's going to these nonpartisan groups,
Senator Birch Bayh.
giving speeches
It's extremely important
to the American Bar Association,
that when the President of the United States is elected,
The League of Women Voters.
the Chamber of Commerce,
we know with confidence that he is the President of the United States.
Saying that we have a problem here.
again, Birch Bayh staffer Bob Blameyer.
I'm telling you, it was so exciting.
Senator Bayh has launched a campaign
It was on TV every night.
establishing a nationwide movement to do away with the Electoral College.
Hammering home this idea.
Which was
Each of us, whether we live in Rhode Island or Texas,
one word:
Indiana, Alaska,
equality.
each one of us ought to have the same opportunity to elect the president. It ought to be one person, one vote, and it seems to me there's no excuse for any other system.
One person, one vote.
Everybody's vote should count the same.
And by 1969,
Opinion polls show that around 80% of the people favor a more direct election of presidents.
80% of Americans agreed with him.
Bayh intends to get Congress to pass a direct election law this year.
And so, 1969, his amendment goes in front of the House.
And what happened was,
Boom!
overwhelming.
Huge victory. 339 to 70.
What?
Easy pass.
Wow.
Unbelievable.
It was just amazing.
I mean, right now it would be extremely difficult to get a House vote of 80% to declare what day it was, or to declare Christmas to be a holiday. But
As Alex Kesar points out,
then the action switches to the Senate. And in the Senate,
Birch hits a wall. A wall made up of 2 different groups of people. One of them was senators from small states.
Now, small state senators, mostly Republican, said, oh, well, we get 2 votes automatically. because we have 2 senators, and that was the compromise made at the Constitutional Convention.
Remember, those 2 senators was the thumb on the scale for the small states.
Right.
So, I mean, think of Wyoming, Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, these states that have these electoral votes and no voters.
These 2 votes are a big deal.
And the small state senators wanted to preserve these 2 electoral votes.
So that was one group. And then the other group, standing in his way, were Southern segregationists. And they were against Birch's amendment because the Electoral College, in a winner-take-all system, gave them more power while continuing to erase black voters. It was almost like that same thing back at the convention with the 3/5 clause.
Okay.
Because white segregationists could use the black people in their state to count towards the state population, which gave them more electoral voters, more power. But at the same time, because of the system, the winner-take-all system, the overwhelming white majority would wipe out and erase the black vote.
So it becomes something of a article of faith that the Electoral College is key to protecting the, quote, Southern way of life.
Senator James Allen of Alabama, he had a quote, something to the effect that the Electoral College is the South's only political advantage left. Let's keep it.
The Senate has refused to shut off debate to the proposed constitutional amendment to elect presidents by a direct popular vote.
And basically, because of these 2 groups of senators, small state Republicans and Southern segregationists, Birch's amendment gets stuck in the Senate 6 votes short.
6 votes short of the necessary 2/3, and now electoral reform seems about ready to fall.
But there was one last hope, which came in the form of a very unlikely ally.
Nixon.
Republican President Richard Nixon.
Whether there'll be any action up here on Capitol Hill, it depends pretty much on one man, Richard Nixon.
And Nixon, even though he got elected by the Electoral College, he had said,
it's obsolete.
It's dangerous.
It should go.
Right.
And Jay says Nixon knew how popular Birch's amendment was. He had seen that House vote.
So overwhelming
that right after it, Nixon
made a public statement saying, in view of what the House has done, the only chance for reform of the present system is for the Senate to do the same thing.
And Nixon, being a Republican president, maybe he could put some pressure on these Republicans who were blocking the amendment.
It'll take all the political clout a new president can muster to keep this new Congress from sweeping electoral reform under the legislative rug.
But meanwhile,
again, Jill Lepore.
This other whole drama is unraveling in the Senate Judiciary Committee that Bai could not have anticipated, which is that Nixon has a bunch of Supreme Court nominees that are going to come before the Senate Judiciary Committee on which Bai serves. And Nixon has pledged that he will appoint a Southerner to the court.
So, early 1969, Nixon nominates a judge from South Carolina, Clement Hainsworth.
And Hainsworth, he has this problem.
Hainsworth had made a number of decisions in which he had a financial interest. He owned stock in companies that he made decisions that helped those companies.
And in the confirmation hearings, Birch,
he had no intention of opposing Hainsworth,
planned on voting yes, confirming Hainsworth.
And Birch kept saying, I gave him every opportunity to say, you're right, you know, if I had to do it again, I would have recused myself. And he would never do it. He kept insisting he had done nothing wrong.
And to Birch, it was pretty clear that this guy, if not totally corrupt,
But got personal, financial secrets.
Yeah. And so Birch is like, all right, this guy is not fit for the court. And so...
Good evening. In a severe setback to President Nixon, the Senate today firmly refused to confirm the Supreme Court nomination of Judge Clement Hainsworth.
Birch Bai leads the charge against Nixon's Supreme Court nominee.
President Nixon was obviously not pleased by what the Senate did to his nominee.
The president issued a written statement in which he expressed disappointment and anger over the Senate rejection of Hainsworth.
Hainsworth, the 10th man in history to be so rejected, the first since 1930.
Well, so does that mean like what he's doing to Nixon here, is that going to affect his efforts with the amendment stuff?
At this point, I don't think he knows.
But Nixon says, goddamn Birch Bai, I'm going to go further south and farther right. So he does. So he brings in his next Southerner, this guy Harold Carswell, who's from Florida, who is further south and much further right, but also happens to be completely unqualified for the Supreme Court.
I have to tell you, I looked for a place to hide, but there was no one else there.
This is Birch from an oral history from 2009 done by the University of Virginia's Miller Center, talking about the Carswell nomination.
I have a good recollection how this all happened. Because I'd been sort of commissioned to lead the charge here, I got together in my office all of the groups.
He said he got together union leaders, Jewish leaders, black leaders.
I remember going around the room and saying, "What do you think?" Now, we knew then that Carswell, as a young 25-year-old, when he was running for the state legislature in Georgia, had said, "I yield to no man in my belief in white supremacy." We knew that. Was that enough?
Pretty damning.
Well, but you know, everybody was exhausted fighting the Ainsworth thing. There was no stomach left for another battle. And as we went around the room, here are these people who had thrown themselves on the spears of the opposition in Ainsworth, said, "Well, you know, Birch, Senator, there have been a lot of changes in the South since then. And, you know, Birch, you know, none of us want to be responsible for everything we said when we were 25. And it was that way all the way around until we got to Clarence Mitchell, who was the executive director of the NAACP. We got around to him and he said, "Well, gentlemen," it was almost as we were getting ready to leave, he said, "Gentlemen, I respect where you're all coming from. But in my lifetime of experience, I found that once a person ever feels that way, they never, ever really change their mind."
Birch says that when he went home that night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what Clarence Mitchell had said in that room, and in that moment, he didn't know what to do. Like, here's Nixon, a potential ally for his amendment.
Nixon had just been elected, okay? This is Nixon's first year as a president.
And to shoot down another nominee of his.
It would have been the first time a president had had two nominees defeated in 76 years.
It would humiliate Nixon, likely turn him against Birch, and kill
The thing the country most needs.
his chance at abolishing the Electoral College.
The thing the country least can see that it needs.
There were several times when he said, "If I do this, it's going to hurt me over here."
Oh, like where if he votes no, it might hurt his amendment.
Yes.
Or do you protect the highest court in the land, the most influential court, from having a white supremacist on it for who knows how long? Like, which thing gives you the best outcome?
And I was rolling and tossing. In fact, I got out of bed and crawled into a bed in the guest room.
He didn't want to bother his wife, who was asleep. And he started thinking about, like, in their home, they had their son, Evan, and he'd always been telling Evan, the way that we make change in this country is we work through the system. We always work through the system.
Somehow or other, it came to me that if my face was black and Evan's face was black.
And this guy, Harold Carswell, was sitting on the Supreme Court of the United States.
And I said, "Son, we're going to work through the system." He'd say, "Dad, the system's already said what it thinks about us." So the next morning, I got my staff together and I said, "Come on, we're going to rally the troops. I think we got 25 people who stand up against this guy."
Judge Carswell's nomination died today.
March 1970, while his amendment is still stuck in the Senate, Birch leads the charge against Carswell.
And single-handedly destroyed his chance of confirmation.
The Senate dealt President Nixon another embarrassing defeat, rejecting his second Supreme Court nominee. The end of a long fight.
And so Birch's amendment sits and languishes in the Senate 6 votes short. And Nixon, despite having come out publicly and said the Senate had to act on electoral college reform, despite the fact that Nixon was the one last person who could maybe sway some of these Republican senators who were blocking Birch.
Nixon never lifted a finger.
He didn't do a thing.
He never, ever called a single Republican senator and said, I'd like you to vote for direct popular election.
I was asked if it were true the White House is not helping because of his fight against the president's Supreme Court nominees, Ainsworth and Carswell.
Yeah, I'm not naive enough to suggest that it isn't a possibility, but that's a poor way to run a country.
You know, we can't say for sure that Nixon was retaliating against Birch, but what we do know is that a few years later, it was made public that Nixon kept a list of his political enemies. And the very first name on that list is Birch Bayh.
No.
And that's the thing. Had Birch not tanked Nixon's nominees, maybe Nixon would have pushed some senators around, and maybe, quite possibly, today we would have in the USA a totally different way of picking our president.
Because one thing is true, if it had gotten through that vote in the Senate, it had already passed in the House, the support in the public was above 80% at that point. It would absolutely have been ratified.
Instead, it fell 6 votes short, and that was that. But presidents come and go. A senator can stick around for a while, and Birch would ultimately get another chance at passing his amendment under another president. Only this time, he would find the people he thought he could count on, the people he thought were on his side, were suddenly standing against him. That's after the break.
I'm Al Letson, host of Reveal. From central Mexico to the front lines of Ukraine.
We were given an order not to take any prisoners.
From an abortion clinic in Florida.
A woman was just assaulted.
To the streets of Chicago.
More than 2,000 kilograms of heroin came to Chicago.
Reveal is your weekly dose of investigative reporting.
Somebody has to say something.
Subscribe to Reveal wherever you get your podcasts.
Latif?
Annie?
Radio Lab.
Do you know that every time it seems that the Senate gets into a major squabble, my next guest is in the middle of it. He led the fight against the Ainsworth and Carswell nominations. Would you welcome the junior senator from Indiana, Senator Birch Bayh?
So 1970, Birch's election amendment fails. But during the 70s, he goes on to do some pretty momentous stuff. He passes a different constitutional amendment.
The 26th Amendment.
But the injustice of
lowering the voting age to 18.
a voting system that sends young men to Vietnam, where the cold statistics on the battlefield show that half of them who died in Vietnam weren't old enough to vote for the public official to send them there. Seems to me this is not the type of democratic system we ought to be proud of.
So that made for 2 amendments.
Making him the only person since James Madison, the founding fathers, to write more than one constitutional amendment.
Wow, that's amazing. Wait, was the voting age 21 before?
Yeah. Also,
yeah, he wrote Title IX.
Have you ever heard of Title IX?
No.
It's mostly known for women's college sports.
But it had to do with the real issue of women in higher education.
It's this legislation that basically says that any school that gets any public funding needs to treat men and women equally.
It changed the country.
But throughout all of this, the thing that he is just obsessing over and that he thinks would be his biggest legacy is abolishing the Electoral College. And in the late 70s, he thinks he has his best shot at doing it. And that's because Republican Richard Nixon.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Watergate happened, so he's out of office. Now,
James Earl Carter,
Jimmy Carter,
elected the next president of the United States.
a Democrat from the South, is now the president of the United States. When he takes office, one of the first things he does
President Carter sent Congress today a big package of proposed election reforms.
is he tells Congress,
It included an abolishment of the Electoral College.
we need to get rid of the Electoral College. And in the late 70s, he was set up to do that because now his party, the Democrats, had this big majority in the Senate.
Clear sailing, smooth sailing ahead.
Right. They think they have the votes. But as Birch is getting ready to bring his amendment back to the Senate,
A whole bunch of rabbis
leaders of Jewish organizations
in New York and in California and other places
had started teaming up with leaders in the black community.
And they have joined the conservative South in support of the Electoral College.
What?
I didn't know if I was having a nightmare.
This is another former Birch Bayh staffer, Frederick Williams.
Yeah, they didn't have to cold cock him like that, you know? He had no idea those guys were going that way.
He's like, it's very much an et tu, Brutus kind of a moment,
Yes,
right?
Totally.
It made no sense.
Okay, well, why are they why would they do that?
Well, because there was a belief in parts of the African American community, which is that the Electoral College advantaged black voters because, and this was the theory, that black voters were swing voters in swing states.
There were a number of Jewish leaders that argued the same thing, that we have this impact on how New York goes and how Florida goes.
What can you spell that out a little bit more? Can you explain that?
What they're saying is that if we as a bloc, blacks, for instance, typically have been voting 90% for the Democrat. If their votes can tip which way New York goes, or Florida, or Illinois, or some other state, then they're having a real impact on the Electoral College vote.
Because those states, like New York used to be a swing state.
Yeah, California too, Mississippi too.
And so in these big crucial swing states, black voters and Jewish voters felt they had sort of an outsized power.
I mean, Jesse Jackson,
prominent black leader at the time,
proclaimed, the hands that picked the cotton have now picked the president.
And this is kind of the thing about the Electoral College, especially in a winner-take-all system, is this possibility that a minority group, like black people, or Jewish people, or Hispanic people, or even like labor unions, teacher unions,
Many groups that you could name could become the decisive votes.
any minority in the right state at the right time could become extremely powerful.
And thus, to switch to a national popular vote would remove that power.
And whatever group you belong to, you would just go back to being a tiny minority in the country as a whole. And the fear was from these black leaders and Jewish leaders in the 1970s is that political parties could then just ignore them. And there's this amazing moment in a committee hearing on Birch's amendment, and Birch is obviously present for it. The leader of the National Urban League, very prominent organization, Vernon Jordan, testified at the committee hearing. And he opens his testimony by saying, me and Senator Birch Bayh are very close personal friends. Senator Birch Bayh has been a friend to black people in this country. But I'm here to say we do not support this amendment. And he goes on to basically say, we as a people have been denied power in this country for over 200 years, and now that we finally have some, you're trying to curb it. And basically goes even further to say, if we were to support this switch to the national popular vote for president, our voting power would, quote unquote, melt away.
Just to defend Vernon Jordan, his argument wasn't 100% just, hey, black people are in these states, so we have some power. He has a good quote, too. He said, the Electoral College system acts as a brake to extremism.
So we did also speak to this guy, Harry Roth.
I'm Director of Outreach for Save Our States,
a pro-Electoral College organization.
We defend the Electoral College system, trying to educate lawmakers and their constituents.
And we reached out to him because we saw he wrote an essay about this moment when black leaders and Jewish leaders were coming out against Birch's amendment.
And, I wouldn't say 1979 was the height of racism in America, but, Vernon Jordan, National Urban League, they were around for a while. They saw how bad things could get. And they feared a racial demagogue who hates blacks coming in and winning the presidency by maybe getting enough support from white voters in a time like that. But with the Electoral College, that makes it much more difficult. You have to pay attention to blacks. You have to pay attention to Jews, who I think Jews make up 1% of the population. But Jews make up what percentage of New York? A very, a decent percentage of at least New York City. So they're important in a state like that. It's going to be hard to win New York if you're just attacking Jews left and right.
Oh, okay. So it sounds Birch is just sort of taking this in, sort of like taking these arguments in. What does he do with them? What does he do next?
Well,
I got a call at must have been between 6:30 and 7 o'clock in the morning
Frederick says when Birch first learned about this opposition, that that all these people were flipping on him,
He said, please be in the office at 8 o'clock. We have to deal with this.
and it's hard to say exactly which meeting this occurred at and when it took place, but Birch tells his story of when a man from a prominent black organization and a man from a prominent Jewish organization came to his office, sat down with him, and told him
Direct popular election is not good for us.
that this hurts us in all sorts of ways, and we're not letting you pass this. Just they even asked him to withdraw it.
And Birch says, I've worked my whole life voting for measures to make you equal to everybody else. And you're sitting in my office telling me that you want your vote to count for more. Get the hell out of here.
And Frederick says he would later talk to that same black leader, the one Birch kicked out.
And said, look at man, the senator's been with you all the time, going all the way back to Carswell and Hainsworth. What are you doing here? He says, well, we have no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, just permanent interests.
So basically what happens is these same black Jewish leaders kind of just go down the hall of the Senate and start knocking on doors
Of a handful of liberal Democrats from big states.
And those liberal Democrats, including a young senator from the small state of Delaware, Joe Biden, vote against Birch's amendment. And so in 1979, once again, his amendment fails. But this time, the wall that stops him is liberal Democrats, few remaining segregationists, and small state Republicans. I don't know the degree to which you can say, but was that objectively true that they had more clout or sway as minority groups under the Electoral College versus how much they would have had in the popular vote?
It was probably true in the 1976 election when Carter ran, but it certainly wasn't true as a broad pattern, and it was clearly evident within a very few years that it simply was not a dominant pattern or a clear pattern. It was,
Oh wow! So it was like a truth with a shelf life.
yeah, a very short shelf life.
Okay, so what's Birch's next step?
So 1980, Reagan gets elected in a kind of landslide, and Birch loses his election. He's not in office anymore, and that's the end of his career as a legislator.
It's a sad story.
I'm okay. Well, that's because it sounds like you all were very productive. You all got a lot done.
Well, Birch probably got a lot done, and we always describe this as the one that got away.
Like this is the thing you would think about.
Yeah. It was. He said it was his greatest regret.
Huh. Wow. Yeah. And there's this moment in one of Birch's oral histories where he almost turns on himself and he asks himself what could I have done differently? What could I have done to keep that from happening? And I don't know, from even what I've read, from what we've read, it doesn't feel like there was anything he could have done differently, because this is the thing about the Electoral College. It's distributing power, right? And that's the whole thing about the Electoral College that Birch didn't like, that it was distributing power. He thought power should be equal. And that gets to this kind of central question of democracy, which is should you put thumbs on scales? How do you do it? And for which people? And for how long? And who gets them and who doesn't? And how hard do you press that thumb down? Those are fundamental questions. And they're really hard questions to answer.
Yeah, totally. And it seems like once you do put a thumb on the scale, it's just so hard to take that thumb off.
Yeah, really hard. And Jill even pointed out that after Birch's amendment failed in 1979, that was kind of it.
It's a kind of, powerful pronouncement about the end of the campaign to abolish the Electoral College. Have we ever had a hearing on abolishing the Electoral College since? Do Do we even still do public opinion surveys about it? And the thing is, Birchby was right that the more often a presidential candidate will win the electoral college and lose the popular vote, the more likely it will be that at some point in the future, Americans will refuse to recognize the legitimacy of a president. And it doesn't matter which side you favor, you cannot favor an election where we can't all agree on the result.
This election is close. Everyone knows that. In the race to 270 electoral votes, every vote matters. Here's where to get Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania.
We're going to put New Mexico in play. We're going to put Virginia in play. We're going to put New Hampshire in play.
They are going to run the battleground state of North Carolina. Candidates are fighting to win key Midwestern states. South Asians in the state are the largest and fastest growing Asian voting bloc there. Like Michigan, both are determined to get as much of the union vote there as they can.
The Democrats, if they could see huge African American enthusiasm, they'll continue to play there.
In the Nebraska district, they could, if it's close.
This tells you
Swing the election.
both campaigns agree.
Oh,
Look at all
type
the
of
states in
worker.
Pennsylvania. It's about evenly matched. Then Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, North Carolina, and Nevada. The Democrats behind in North Carolina, waiting to see if they really need it. Waiting to see if the Harris campaign will put significant money into North Carolina.
Matt Kilty and I reported this episode. Matt Kilty and Simon Adler produced it. Matt Kilty, Simon Adler, and Jeremy Bloom contributed original music and sound design. Jeremy Bloom mixed it. Diane Kelly fact-checked it. And Becca Bressler and Pat Walters edited it. We first heard about this story from Jill LaForge, who is writing a book about the Constitution coming out next year. In the meantime, you can read her magisterial history of the United States, These Truths. We've been that on the website, along with Bob Whitmire's spy biography, Alice Kissar's book about college, and so much more.
大家好，我是林凯，我现在呢人在基隆，现在呢是2023年的12月31号，因为我想要去台北以外的地方走走，然后我原本想要开车过来，因为我刚考到驾照嘛，然后期间有练了2-3次车，都还算是顺利吧。但是因为31号我怕人非常多，然后路况我也不是很熟悉，还是有点怕，最后还是搭火车过来了。然后我在基隆其实不太会特别设定说我一定要吃到什么，或我一定要去逛到哪里，纯粹是很随性的走。然后基隆给我的感觉就是很悠闲，然后还蛮轻松的一个地方，当然是不下雨的前提下。像今天虽然天气有点灰灰的，但算是天气很不错的状况，还蛮开心的。要吃那个大肠圈。我刚刚只点大肠圈跟猪心，然后直接帮我写大辣。这种时候应该要开那种老派玩笑，是不是因为我很辣？讲完很尴尬。大肠圈有那种小份的，我是点小份的50块，然后猪心也50块，这样总共100块。猪心，哦，猪心本来就是比较 Q 的部位，因为我很喜欢吃各种的那个动物器官。猪心是也不是很好做好吃的类型，所以这个算是 Q 的蛮刚好，不会太硬，会有那个实感在。我刚刚得知它叫做大肠圈，但是它其实是米肠，因为它是台语是短锅，就是米肠的台语，我台语讲很烂，不好意思。所以就是它拿到是米肠的时候，其实有点惊讶，因为我之前 在别家吃大肠圈，我会自己乱点嘛。然后我点的其实是大肠，但其实大肠圈是米肠，米肠应该是大家都很 OK 会好吃的东西。好吃。然后小黄瓜。平常我们吃的那种甜不辣，再软一点点，然后加上小黄瓜那种就是脆跟软的那种口感交集，还蛮有趣。点个小份吃来做，这样子60块。你要加什么？对。你要这样子拿起来。对，不能变。凉面就加麻酱那种凉面的版，然后它是加酱汁的版本，还蛮所以它一份大概15块。这边是仁爱市场，然后其实我比较常在仁爱市场吃饭，要是来基隆的话，因为它的选择还蛮丰富，而且它人不像庙口来这么多，因为庙口是很热闹，但是你必须要赶快吃完，因为它的位置比较小，然后你可能也需要外带之类，但是仁爱市场里面你就可以蛮悠哉的把东西吃完。像它1楼也有一家大肠圈，我比较常吃那一家，然后它一开始是，它现在还是摊贩，只是一开始是连那个地标都找不太到，然后就有人有建一个地标叫无名大肠圈，然后它现在就是变成叫仁爱市场大肠圈，就比较容易找到。不过它也是5点之后才开，所以我今天就吃小三也是很好吃。它是美牙吗？美牙要穿小丸子的衣服。好快的手机。这个多少？就蛮可爱的。结果就乱买。会买，因为本来这个价钱我都买。好，那就买。对，我想。我还蛮喜欢这种，但我怕后来只会有我自己吃，因为这种一定要配茶，它不能单吃，因为单吃就是满嘴都是粉，那配茶就好。延伸就要买这个芋泥球，它就是芋泥搓成的球，哇，听起来好难吃，但又好吃。我买2个，然后这样60块，然后这样子扣下来110，所以1盒芋泥球是50块。 钱跟你工资应该不会到很高吧？应该到。好吃，变成爱玉，爱玉，然后我吃豆花，然后再吃那种豆类的那种奶的那种部位合在一起，然后不会觉得不自然，就是因为有一点点冷，然后它
访问新团长入围的有。
访到新团奖入围的有
所以他就觉得
百灵果 News 的 KK Show 255大牙西西歪被亲生家人抛弃了29年，意外发现是人口贩卖。志起七七图文不符，刘。
Of the stream. If you don't get your question answered during the stream, feel free to email me, jb@joshuabardwell.com. Don't want anybody feeling like they are getting ignored. Just the stream is so busy, it's not always possible to answer all. It's always possible to not answer all the questions. So, oh no, Siati is sick. I'm really sorry to hear that. Yeah, take it easy. And get better. So let's start. Let's start with a question. We're going to start with this question. It does come from a Discord channel member. In case you guys don't know, this is my Discord server here on the right side of the screen. Those people are on my Discord server because they're my patrons. They subscribe to my Patreon. And, you know, that means I give them just a little bit of extra attention during the stream. We'll start off with a question from a patron. Can I get audio output if I use the URV analog adapter using 3.5mm jack splitter? So here's the URV analog adapter that they are talking about. This is a little board that lets you use a analog receiver module. We don't have any image of one plugged in, but basically you plug a Fat Shark module into it, and you can receive analog video signals, and then it outputs it on a 3.5mm plug, which you can plug into any AV source that can take a 3.5mm feed. And yeah, if you had the right cable, you could split that and get an audio out. Far be it from me to tell you exactly which cable you need to get audio out, is, you know, because like one of these is audio and one is video and so forth. But yeah, there's no reason you couldn't do that. One for video, one for the earphone. Yeah, in fact, that's a cable that exists. Like, what you would need, like, let's just go to Amazon and like try searching, right? Hang on, switch accounts. There we go. This account, and we'll get 3.5mm audio video cable splitter. I don't know. So like here is a cable, yeah. So this is the kind of thing you would want, right? And this is going to take, and I don't know for sure that this is the correct cable, because there's actually different pinouts of this 3.5mm plug. It's not universally true, and I think Fat Shark actually has a non-standard pinout. So like I'm not 100% sure this exact cable will work, but like this will give you the audio left, right, and then you would just need to get another cable to combine the audio. Like you would need to get like RCA to 1/8 or 3.5mm, right? You would need to get something like this, which would convert it back to 3.5mm and like just sort of combine the cables until you got what you wanted. So yeah, 100% you could do that. The main giveaway is, the main catch is that the Fat Shark goggles, for sure, their AV pinout is not the same as many cameras. I remember when you used to buy AV cables for Fat Shark goggles, you would need to buy several of them, and some of them wouldn't work. And then you'd find one with the right pinout and it would work, and it was kind of trial and error. I don't know if that's true for this UAV adapter. Maybe they use the more common pinout, but you do want to be aware that, like, if you find that, like, you're not getting audio, and then, like, it's the audio and the ground are switched or something like that, then, yeah, then that's why you need to figure out the pinout. Well, hopefully that's helpful. Is there any way to transmit audio when using high-definition video? The short answer is no. So audio, analog video transmitters have the ability to transmit audio. And the reason for that is that they're essentially transmitting a television signal, an old analog television signal. And television has the capability to transmit an audio sideband. In fact, it can transmit stereo audio. And so most video transmitters don't transmit any audio, but some of them do. They have a microphone input, or some of them have a built-in microphone, and they'll just transmit that audio to your goggles, and then your goggles can output that over the headphone port. The HD video transmitters don't do that. None of them transmit audio, and there is no, like, realistic way to get them to do it. The original DJI Air unit had a microphone on it, the big one, not the Vista. It had a microphone on it, and there was, if you rooted it and you installed WTFOS, there was the beginnings of a hack that would allow it to transmit audio back to the goggles. And I don't know if that ever was fully realized, or it doesn't really matter because nobody flies the original Air unit anymore anyway. Well, hardly anybody, I would say. And so essentially the answer is no. And you might be thinking, well, what if I could just add some kind of other transmitter? Well, I mean, theoretically, you could add an analog video transmitter to your drone, hook it up with a microphone, and then transmit that signal back to what? To an analog receiver module on...
Even Birchfly's little jingle is on there, what an earworm that is. The last thing I have to say, if you're living in the United States and you are able to, please go vote. Peer pressure others to do the same. Thank you so much for listening, and good luck to us all.
Send him to Washington on by, you can rely. In November, remember him at the polls, his name you can't pass by. Indiana's own Birchfly. Indiana's own Birchfly.
Hi, I'm David, and I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. Radiolab was created by Jad Abumrad and is edited by Soren Wheeler. Lulu Miller and Latif Nasser are our co-hosts. Dylan Keefe is our director of sound design. Our staff includes Simon Adler, Jeremy Bloom, Becca Bressler, W. Harry Fortuna, David Gable, Maria Paz Gutierrez, Sindhu Nyanam Sambandan, Matt Keelty, Annie McEwen, Rebecca Lax, Alex Neeson, Sarah Kari, Sarah Sandback, Ariane Wack, Pat Walters, and Molly Webster. Our fact checkers are Diane Kelly, Emily Krieger, and Natalie Middleton.
Hi, this is Ellie from Cleveland, Ohio. Leadership support for Radiolab science programming is provided by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, Science Sandbox, a Simons Foundation initiative, and the John Templeton Foundation. Foundational support for Radiolab was provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation.
You come to the New Yorker Radio Hour for conversations that go deeper, with people you really want to hear from, whether it's Bruce Springsteen or Questlove or Olivia Rodrigo, Liz Cheney, or the godfather of artificial intelligence, Jeffrey Hinton, or some of my extraordinarily well-informed colleagues at the New Yorker. So join us every week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, wherever you listen to podcasts.
recognizing that that means yields cannot come down a great deal. But then we're also in an election season, and we're looking ahead to the debt ceiling becoming an issue again at the end of the year. On December 31st, it expires. So I think there's a lot of stuff in play, and good earnings are the thing that's going to kind of keep it all in check, in my opinion.
Because your base case is basically where we are right now in the S&P 500, 5,800. I know your high end is 6,000. Can you just go through your thinking? Because previously you had 6,100 as the high end. So why the change?
I just was looking at valuations and getting to be, above 22 times and thinking, there's a lot that could happen between now and the end of the year, especially looking ahead to the deficit issues, and thought there's probably going to be a little more resistance from here to the end of the year. And so I just took down that 20% probability. Not really any more than that, because I think a lot of the factors are still in play that are keeping us moving higher. But it feels like there's also more resistance as we go into the election.
It's interesting. The conversations we had last week were about the challenge of higher yields. I'm looking at 2-year notes this morning. 4.11. Julian Emanuel said, look, the high duration, those big tech, and we've got 5 of the Mag 7 reporting this week. That longer duration kind of equity gets challenged at around 4.15. Is that what clients are worried about when they look at this portfolio of Mag 7?
I don't know if they're actually worried about that. I think they look at the underlying fundamentals much more long term and say, is this going to be, because your yields don't matter as much if you can grow out of it. And so looking at things like Tesla being a surprise last week, I think kind of a surprise because of the fact that the robotaxi event took, some expectations down. I think expectations matter a lot too. And that is one thing I'm worried about, is that earnings expectations for the top 10 are positive 30% earnings growth for Q3 and negative almost 5% for the remaining 490. And so that's what I worry about. And this is mostly driven in the top 10 by NVIDIA and Lilly. It's just those two. So it's those two secular trends of, AI chips really and GLP-1 drugs. And what does that mean for the rest?
Did Tesla change a lot for clients last week? The fact that you could have this stock rallying 22%. Did it change sentiment, especially heading into more big tech earnings?
Our customer base, what they tend to do is trim winners. They maintain their core positions, and so that was reflected in our activity. And then you see things that provide perhaps an opportunity for the longer term. And McDonald's, for example, becomes a place that you see some capital going as a result.
We are, as you say, getting ready for a monster week of earnings. You look at the bar, you say we've come down from 11% in the second quarter to 4% in the third quarter. So any kind of disappointment here, you really are down to the margin of let's say, the real optimism being challenged, isn't it?
Yeah, in Q4, expectations for the top 10 is only 10%, and for the remaining 490 is 15% earnings growth. I mean, that's it's predicting the fact that we're going to have this broadening of a rally beyond kind of the top 10,
yes,
beyond the Mag 7. And I think a lot depends on the election. I think a lot depends on yields. I mean, you're seeing yields are impacting small caps, right? You haven't had a good run recently in small caps. And the bond market, people are saying, okay, the market is starting to price in a Trump rally, but a Trump win even. But I feel like you're seeing only that in kind of the yields and less so in the market.
I was going to say, what wins out here in terms of noise? Is it earnings? Is it the economic data? We have jobs and then a Fed decision. Is it the election? Is it some terrifying combination of all three?
They all really matter. The job market will impact yields. It will impact what the Fed does. And it also just impacts sentiment. And then, but earnings over the long term are the driver of markets. So that also matters, but rates really impact where yields or where earnings go, I should say. At least except for the top 10. I think the top 10 kind of can cruise no matter what.
You see, there's a deep secret part of me which sort of says, you maybe missed some of the big upside in some of those big top 10. A disputed election is something that will deliver more volatility. We don't know what kind of volatility, but a disputed election, something like 2000, which as various people have said to us, is if stocks drop, is a golden opportunity.
I do think it's an opportunity because I definitely believe.
I'm not hoping for that by the way, not as a base case scenario.
Not
everybody's
hoping
talking
for it,
about
but I think typically you see yield. It depends on who wins, but usually you see volatility rise in the summer before, which we did actually have. And then you also see, depending on who wins, volatility rise as we get closer to the election. And we haven't really seen that yet. I do think volatility is actually gonna rise in the week or month or so after, and that's usually like the worst returns before you kind of get back. So I would say it was an opportunity.
And just before we let you go, I want to end where we start, and that's on earnings. As we get the big AI, the hyperscalers reporting, what do people care about this time around? Because before it was just the promise of AI, it turns into spend and how much of that is actually monetized. What do you think the focus will be this time?
I was gonna say CapEx. Like I think CapEx and margins. And I think that was the one thing that you have seen from a couple of like early reportings is that margins have looked a little better than expected. And that was one of the ingredients of that soft landing is that margins are allowed to be a little bit compressed going into it because it means that the labor market stays strong.
Right. I mean, seeing earnings like Coke where they can keep raising prices, it's remarkable when we thought that wasn't happening anymore. Stephanie, thank you so much. That is Stephanie Guild of Robinhood. Okay, coming up, oil is falling. Israel strikes military targets in Iran, avoiding oil infrastructure. We're going to have the details for you next on your Bloomberg Brief.
It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, the China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, the China Show. Weekdays around the world right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. The top names in tech are on Bloomberg.
A large number of countries are subsidizing their regional data centers so that they could become able to build out their AI infrastructure. They recognize that their country's knowledge, their country's data, digital data, is also their natural resource. Not just the land they're sitting on, not just the air above them, but they realize now that their digital knowledge is part of their natural and national resource. And they ought to harvest that and process that and transform it into their national digital intelligence. And so this is what we call sovereign AI. You could imagine almost every single country in the world will eventually recognize this and build out their AI infrastructure.
Nobody covers technology like Bloomberg. Context changes everything. Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
With a surge in Bitcoin, you have crypto stocks also surging.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people,
This is a political attack, and we must hold our elected officials accountable.
the transactions,
Really a record-breaking moment.
Bitcoin is the exit strategy.
and the technology.
Awareness is going to grow, and these things grow the overall industry.
Crypto as an asset class is here to stay.
Bloomberg Crypto, only on Bloomberg.
Whoever hurts us, we hurt him. And this is the principle that guided us to this day. And this is the principle that will guide us in the future as well. The attack in Iran was precise and powerful and achieved all its goals.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after the airstrikes against Iran, which were in response to a missile barrage earlier this month. Joining us with the latest is Bloomberg senior editor Bobby Ghosh. Bobby, should we, as the market seems to be interpreting this, interpret it as de-escalatory strikes from Israel onto Iran?
I mean, there is a quality about that old cliche about frogs being in gradually boiling water and you don't realize the water is boiling around you. This year has been remarkable. Iran has struck Israel a couple of times. Israel has now responded directly with planes flying into Iran and striking. And yet oil markets seem to have taken this into their stride. Global markets in general have taken this into their stride. This is now the new normal. A year ago, if we were having this conversation of direct strikes between Iran and Israel, we would all have our heads on fire. But this just tells you how far we have come in accepting that conflict between these two countries is inevitable. This is the status quo now. Israel attacks Iran. Iran, sooner or later, there will be some kind of a strike in response. As long as both sides signal that the strikes are coming, as long as there's not a large number of casualties on either side, as long as oil installations are not affected, it seems like the world can absorb even these shocks.
Well, it shouldn't be dismissed what Israel did go after in terms of the strategic sites that it took out. There might not have been oil and it might not have been nuclear, but they were strategic and they sent a very clear message. If I look at the language from Ayatollah Khamenei, he talks about Israel's strategic miscalculation should be countered. If you look at the foreign ministry this morning, Iran will not forgo its right to respond to Israel's aggression. But do you get a sense that we're no longer at level one critical response, and we're now in some other phase, which is a de-escalatory phase, which maybe gives the opportunity to begin to talk about something substantive on ceasefire?
I'm hesitant to use the word de-escalatory. I think that for that to happen, we'd have to see real improvement, sort of real progress on the ground, whether that is with peace negotiations between Israel and Hamas, with cessation, at least temporary, of hostilities against Hezbollah in Lebanon. So we're still very much in the rhetoric stage of this. Yes, both sides have an incentive to play down what happened over the weekend, but that does not change the real facts. As you pointed out, Max, Israel flew jet planes thousands of miles deep into Iranian territory and destroyed missile batteries, missile factories, did some real damage. And also demonstrated, by the way, they can hit Iran wherever they want to. It was Israel's choice not to hit oil installations or nuclear installations. But the underlying message that we can strike deep into Iranian territory and inflict damage, that message has got to have gotten through to the Iranians. The trouble is, on the both sides, the real risk is both sides regard this as now acceptable behavior, that they can take pot shots at each other directly and get away with it. If both sides don't come away from these exchanges of fire feeling that went too far and we should really back away, then the risk is that they will not have a disincentive to stop this kind of behavior. And that's what really concerns me. The fact that this is now the new normal, the new status quo, insert your cliche here, that's something we should be concerned about. I think it's not wise for markets to take the view that, hey, we can get by with this.
I mean, the other thing I'm kind of hearing from you too is just because Israel didn't strike energy facilities this time doesn't mean that they won't next time.
Exactly right. If Iran has not learned its lesson, and so far the rhetoric suggests it's not, then the next time Israel will feel obliged to up the ante. That's the risk with this sort of situation. Each side feels like it has to up the ante just a little bit, and each side figures that, oh, we can calibrate this just right, that there won't be a huge blowback. But sooner or later, somebody will make a mistake. And we are at knife's edge, and we should not get used to being in that place.
But this is the difference, which is we've become, as far as market observers, desensitized really to the scale of response. But then you look at the language from the Jordanians and you begin to understand this conflict is far from over. Bobby, thank you so much for being with us this morning. That is our senior editor there, Bobby Ghosh, tracking the very latest. Here in the US, we are 8 days away from the big day. US presidential election, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Trump making their final push to the voters.
We've got 9 days. 9 days. 9 days left in one of the most consequential elections of our lifetime. We must not wake up the day after the election and have any regrets about what we could have done in these next 9 days.
We must defeat Kamala Harris and stop her radical left agenda with a landslide that is too big to rig. So you need to get out and vote.
Joining us now is our government reporter, Jack Fitzpatrick. Jack, good to have you with us. Both candidates had a busy weekend. Harris with Michelle Obama, along with Beyonce, and then last night, let's just kick off with the latest from the Trump rally. It was very much for the MAGA base. It was very much emboldening his core group of supporters. There has been a bit of blowback on some of the lines from the comedian on Puerto Rico. But if you stand back and you look at his rallying over the weekend versus Harris's rallying over the weekend, there's a striking difference between the two.
Yes, there is clearly a difference in strategy. The Trump campaign is trying to energize their supporters, trying to engage their supporters, and trying to communicate to the people who already support Trump that it is very important that they go out and vote. This was not meant to win over any key block of undecided voters, as you mentioned. They seem to have alienated Puerto Rican voters with the comments by a comedian who kind of opened for Trump, calling it a floating pile of garbage. But even among the other speakers at this, I would note that Elon Musk said that he could cut $2 trillion from the annual federal budget. That kind of comment, which by definition would mean cuts to popular entitlement programs, either Social Security or Medicare, is aimed at conservatives, aimed at people who support Trump, and not aimed at expanding the base. Harris, meanwhile, as you saw with Liz Cheney, as for an example, is trying to go after at least some Republicans or independents who might consider voting for her.
Jack, we also learned over the weekend that the Washington Post wouldn't be endorsing either candidate. The reporting there has suggested that it was Jeff Bezos' call for fear of blowback. It kind of echoes what we also heard reporting around Jamie Dimon, that he wasn't publicly endorsing Harris because he was also afraid of that blowback. How does this all translate? Does it break through any of the noise that this is the kind of environment we're in right now?
It's an event that does break through the noise. The lack of an endorsement from the Washington Post as well as the Los Angeles Times, both reportedly at the behest of their owners who blocked planned editorials in favor of Harris that were written by the editorial board. It's hard to predict how that may affect the last week or so of the election. It's not something the candidates themselves have really gotten into, but anecdotally you can tell there's a bit of frustration, largely from Harris supporters, and concern about the role of billionaires in the mechanics of American electoral politics. So it's something to keep an eye on, it's something to watch, and something to understand may have an effect on people's views on the election and the U.S. government.
Jack, really appreciate it. That is Bloomberg's Jack Fitzpatrick. Okay, let's get to Boeing this morning. The troubled plane maker is planning to raise more than $15 billion. Bloomberg sources tell us that they are avoiding to get a credit downgrade to junk, something it's been under threat of. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Kate Duffy. Kate, what are the details of this capital raise?
Well, Boeing really needs this capital raise in order to prevent its investment grade rating from slipping to junk, and also to fund a recovery from a 7-week-long strike that has closed its factories and stopped production in some areas of the US. And before last week, we saw, or we expected, that Boeing was going to make some kind of recovery next year, but from now what we know, they're going to burn cash through the fourth quarter of this year and through the first part of next year as well. So on top of the financial pressure, we also have Boeing customers which are waiting for all of these planes coming through, and that's also stunting their growth plans and their passenger outlook. So this capital raise would really give a boost to Boeing's liquidity.
Kate, good morning to you. 64% of the strikers rejected the last pay offer last week. Has there been a restart in negotiations? Is the government actively trying to bring both sides together again? What's the latest there?
Yes, yeah, so as you said, last week they rejected the new proposed deal. This was a 35% wage increase over 4 years. They're not happy with this. The sticking point is pension. They want the pension in the contract, and that's something that Boeing is not prepared to put in there right at this minute. That's their red line. The latest update is that actually the union have had talks with the US Labour Department about restarting negotiations with Boeing, and this is really critical because Boeing is actually burning about $100 million a day because of the strike, and so it's critical for them to get back to the table and to agree a deal. to go forward.
And for customers of Boeing, it continues to be pain. Haslinda Zaman of Bloomberg caught up with the General Electric CEO, Larry Culp, and they discussed Boeing. Let's just take a listen to that.
There's a lot happening there. We'll let Kelly Ortberg and the team at Boeing talk about the schedule for the 777X. I think their last comments talked about an entry into service in 2026. We're thrilled to be the only engine under wing with our new 9X engine. I think the fact that customers are very keen to see Boeing work through the development and the certification tasks that lie ahead of them is really good news for Boeing.
Kate, this has always been the assumption. There are so many people who rely on Boeing. It's half of a global duopoly. Is this as bad as it gets for supply and delivery for Boeing?
Well, we're yet to see how bad it can get. It's got pretty bad. Ryanair, they're one of the customers of Boeing, one of Boeing's biggest customers that are still waiting for the 736 plane to come through. And ultimately, lots of other airlines are as well. You've got Southwest, Lufthansa and IAG. They're also waiting for the 777X to come through. And this has been something that they've been waiting for about 5 years now. So it's a long time. They're dealing with aging fleets. And ultimately, this is costing them more because they have to go into more maintenance. So the quicker that they can get these planes, the better. But it's certainly having a knock-on effect.
Kate, thank you very much keeping us up to date on the Boeing story right here on the Bloomberg Group. Context matters.
From our studios in New York and San Francisco, our expert hosts have the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch, plus the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech, right in the middle of the trading action, every weekday, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, only on Bloomberg. Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything. The countdown is on. Everything you need to get the edge of the end of the market day.
Big tech earnings kick off later this afternoon.
Gilead is coming out right now. We have Take-Two numbers. Back to the markets, right? Our bread and butter.
NVIDIA is one of the best stories of the tech space.
That actually matters a whole lot more.
It might shock some of your viewers.
You're watching The Close.
Get ahead of tomorrow's trading with The Close. Weekdays on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Right?
Bringing you up to the minute geopolitical news whenever and wherever it happens. I'm Stephen Engel at the Forbidden City in Beijing, and this is Bloomberg.
Let's get you set up for your trading week because it is a very big one. Alphabet is going to be kicking off this week's big tech earnings. That comes Tuesday after the market close. That will be followed by Microsoft and Meta on Wednesday, Apple and Amazon on Thursday. And then, Manis, we're going to be wrapping the week up with the jobs report on Friday. 110 is the average analyst estimate. The low, Manis, a negative 10,000K from Bloomberg Economics. That would be the first negative print since 2020.
Yeah, and the hot optimistic number was somewhere around 180. Once we take account of the hurricanes, once we take account of the Boeing strikes, which are continuing. Keep an eye on the bond market. Not only are you get $20 trillion worth of market cap reporting in equities, but you're also going to get the budget. You're also going to get the issuance requirements this week for the bond market. It's a hot bond market.
It really is. Everything is leading to higher yields, which is an issue for everyone who said that there's reinvestment risk and you should get back in. Okay, that's it for brief surveillance. We'll take it from here.
Well, I think what's happening is we're starting to bring realism into the discussion. I mean, I think understanding the global energy system, the scale of that system, the important role that it plays in everybody's life around the world, and then thinking something that's been built over 150 years, trillions and trillions of dollars of investment that's playing such a critical role in the economies around the world, how you transition out of that system. And I would say transition from a higher carbon emission system to a lower carbon emission system. We started out with a very narrow solution set focused on wind and solar and EVs, and assumed or aspired that that would address the total set of the issue, and it doesn't. We need to be more realistic around, to Patrick's point, there are a lot of solutions that are going to be required. We should stay focused on the problem statement, which is emissions, and reducing those emissions, and less focused on exactly how to achieve that, and let every company, every sector, all technologies compete for the most cost-efficient way to reduce those emissions, and we will make progress much faster, which will mean making today's system more emissions efficient, while we introduce new systems that have lower emissions. And then with time, you will transition and we'll make progress.
There is a sense, I think, that the markets are increasingly worried about some kind of fiscal risk.
Companies are just a little less optimistic than they were a few quarters ago.
The issue of the year has really been whether we would broaden out, and I would say that is happening.
If you look at equities, we're going to get growth, right? So, forward returns are just going to be much more muted.
Corporate America is sitting there saying, I'm in a pretty good position. The economy's doing well.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
Your week started live from New York City this morning. Good morning for our audience worldwide. Bloomberg Surveillance starts right now with equity futures on the S&P 500 up by 0.6%, looking to snap back from a week of losses on the S&P 500, going into an absolutely stacked week of earnings. It is the best week of earnings season. Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, and Meta. Then we've got the economic data, concluding with payrolls on Friday. The median estimate in our survey is 110. The high is 164 at RBC. The low, negative 10K at Bloomberg Economics.
The difficulty here is just how muddied has the water gotten given some of the strikes, given the hurricane. Pantheon Macroeconomics came out and said that strikes will likely cut the payrolls by 40,000. Hurricane Milton probably cut it by 25,000. So pick your number. To me, the biggest potential surprise is an upside surprise representing strength, and that is what I wonder is if that's going to get the bigger response potentially in the bond markets.
Absolutely, because also the wide margin of these calls, this out of consensus call from Bloomberg Economics, how bad was that Hurricane Milton effect that it would be a -10 print? Also, what is going to be interesting in this data is the revisions from the blowout September report. Are they revised lower or higher at 254,000? But all of this comes 8 days we are away from the U.S. election. All of this data is going to drop when we have a U.S. presidential election and then the Fed meeting, potentially not knowing the results of that U.S. presidential election.
We've got a lot to get through this morning, including this move in the oil market. Crude is down by close to 6% on Brent. The WTI is seeing that move right now, 67.39 on WTI crude. Limited strikes on Iran.
A sigh of relief, really, in the oil market by the fact that no supplies were disrupted. When Israel decided to directly attack Iran, they didn't go after civil, nuclear, or oil facilities. So the market is breathing a sigh of relief. You had the administration come out late in the evening, Friday, talking about that they think this is the end of this direct cycle between Israel and Iran. But of course, you have to think the end until when?
I have to ask, really, is this de-escalation? They went after some really significant military assets, including their possibility of making fuel for some of those long-range ballistic missiles. You have to wonder how much this really is the end of the conflict and how much this de-escalates. And frankly, the ball now very much in the court of the Iranians, and it is not clear how they're going to respond.
In absolute terms, it's not good. I think we all agree on that. But it's always relative to markets, and markets were anticipating the very real possibility that energy infrastructure might be struck. The fact that they didn't strike that over the weekend, you take out that premium, we're down 5 to 6%.
Fair enough. This market is binary. That immediate threat not there, okay, we can put it off, and evidently that's not going to be imminent. So that is absolutely the sigh of relief that you're seeing in markets today.
Not a sigh of relief for Boeing. That stock is down by 0.9% in the pre-market. We're reporting here at Bloomberg that Boeing is considering a $15 billion capital raise. Lisa, that would be the largest equity raise in the last 4 years.
Trying to stave off some more time and potentially avoid getting downgraded as the strike does continue. A real question here with Boeing. Even if they do get some sort of reprieve from the downgrade, how much can they really get confidence from their investors at a time where it's not clear what they are going to look like? The Wall Street Journal reporting they were going to divest some of their aerospace space intergalactic
Starliner.
Yeah, the Starliner. Thank you for saving me there. But that to me really highlights what's on the table and potentially the changes that could come down the pike.
Historically, the Starliner is part of American history, so that would be huge if they decide to look at options potentially of selling this asset. That was one thing we learned over the weekend, as they need this boost to liquidity, potentially raising those funds. And third, the Department of Labor going back to the drawing table with the union saying, come on guys, you've got to get back to the table. This is the 7th week of those workers on the picket line.
That's the stock to watch this morning. Here's an asset class to watch, the bond market. Bond yields this morning a little bit higher, up by 2 basis points on a 10-year, 426. The climb resumes. It's not just the economic data, a lot of supply this week as well.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. It's not only supply, but we also get quarterly Treasury refunding announcement coming out on Wednesday. But we have a stacked lineup of bond auctions. And I want to say it's unusually stacked because they actually brought forward a lot of the auctions. So we have $69 billion of 2-year notes, $70 billion of 5 notes. That's just today. And then tomorrow we get $44 billion of 7-year notes, all at a time where it is very unclear what the longer-term trajectory is for both the deficit as well as inflation. This is a significant concern. I just want to read what Peter Steer had to say because I think it's important. Despite the election looming, bond vigilantes and earnings are likely to be bigger drivers of this market than anything else as we head into month end.
We did that just for you.
Thank you.
That was just for you. We'll speak to the man himself who coined the term bond vigilantes in just a second as well. Ed Yardeni of Yardeni Research, looking ahead to a busy week of economic data. Former US Ambassador to Switzerland, Ed McMullen, on Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden, and Norman Rule of CSIS following Israel's limited attack on Iran. We begin this hour with stocks bouncing back from their first weekly loss in 7. Traders looking ahead to the last big data point before the Fed's next decision. Payrolls due on Friday. Ed Yardeni of Yardeni Research writing, the data since the last meeting of the FOMC suggests the 50 basis point cut that occurred was probably too much, too soon. That raises the risk that price inflation might stop moderating and that stock prices might continue to mount up. Ed joined us now for more. Ed, welcome to the program, sir. Let's start with the stock market. Are you calling this a melt-up?
I think it has been a bit of a melt-up. I mean, look, we're looking at valuation multiples that are getting right up there, close to where we were right before the tech wreck in the late 1990s. We saw a melt-up that got the forward PE at S&P 500 up to 25. Now we're at 22, so it's starting to look like it.
Ed, we're seeing bond yields back up as well. Higher again this morning by 2 basis points at 426. Can we sort of fold the election into this conversation as well? Do you think the election and the GOP sweep potentially would open the way to a move back towards 5% on a 10-year?
Unfortunately, it is a conceivable scenario. The bond vigilantes are definitely mounting up. I mean, the low bond yield a few weeks ago was 3.65%, and now we're at 4.26%. I think overnight we got the 4.285%. Yeah, I think there's a possibility here that if we get a sweep with either the Democrats or the Republicans, the bond market will conclude that nothing will stop either party from spending a lot, maybe cutting taxes a lot for some folks, not for others, and all in all, continuing to widen the deficit and the debt. Meanwhile, the interest payments continue to accumulate. We'll probably hit $1 trillion, which will make lots of headlines within the next few months.
And I have to say, it's a very compelling argument to me. And I worry about the deficit, and I watch the bond auctions, and I see the increasing size. And last week, I was in Washington, D.C. with all of these international central bankers and these international bankers, and where do all of their clients want to put their money? Even with all these concerns, talking with the U.S. election, the deficit, the United States, they still want to come here. So what is going to make people say, no mas, we're done?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, the reality is that the dollar's actually strengthened at the same time as the bond yield has gone up. So that suggests that people are concluding that if the bond vigilantes are getting the message out to the Fed that they don't want any more rate cuts, that they think it was premature, that strengthens the dollar, which means that people are buying these bonds. So I wouldn't get too excited about the bond yield going up to 5%, but it's certainly looking more realistic than it did a few weeks ago. And a few weeks ago, we thought that the Fed did cut prematurely, that the economy was going to surprise them to the upside, and that's exactly what's happened.
There's also been a contradiction here. People used to think that higher bond yields would excise a pretty big tax on equity valuations. What we've seen is this melt-up continuing despite the melt-up in yields.
Yes.
What we have seen, though, is a change with that rotation being challenged into small caps and into the other 493 stocks. Do you think that is what this is going to look like into year-end?
Yeah, well, I think if in fact the market is starting to perceive that the Fed isn't going to ease as much as they thought after the 50 basis point cut on September 18th, then I think the market starts to get cool off to the idea that the Russell 2000 is going to outperform and go back to the S&P 500, and maybe even go back to just 7 of those stocks, the so-called Magnificent Seven. And look, to John's point, I don't want to get too worried about a melt-up here on a valuation basis if it turns out to be an earnings-led melt-up. We certainly have had Tesla, for example. Maybe it wasn't so much earnings as hype, but as you folks point out, this is going to be a busy week for earnings, and we could have some upside surprises from the Magnificent Seven, which would drive the NASDAQ to further record highs, even in the face of bond yields going up.
Ed, I want to get back to where you see bond yields going, because you say that we could get higher yields regardless if it's a Republican or Democrat sweep. But when you look at how the Senate races are looking to go, it looks like you can pretty much take the Dem sweep off the table. If there's going to be a sweep, it's likely going to be red. So tell us a little bit more what that could mean, not just to yield short terms and long terms, but also other assets.
Well, it gets as confusing as Trump's policies are confusing. You know, the idea of raising tariffs across the board by 20% and against China 60% is probably a bargaining position. I mean, it's hard to imagine that this administration would get advice from its own economists saying that that would be a good idea, because it certainly would be inflationary. So bargaining chip for the deal maker Trump. would make sense, but as a realistic alternative to taxes and incomes, that doesn't make that much sense. On the other hand, Trump wants to produce more oil, which would be disinflationary for the U.S. But there's no discussion by either candidate about doing anything to reduce the deficits, to deal with the debt, to deal with the exploding net interest expense of the government. So I think the bond reaction to a sweep, as I said, by either side, I want to be balanced about this, but you're right, the sweep is looking increasingly, if it's going to happen, it would happen with Trump winning because of what you said about the Senate and the House. And in that scenario, the bond yield, I think, easily goes to 4.5%.
Ed, take us through what can happen if this election drags on or if it's contested.
I don't even want to think about that possibility. The country is so partisan that, we've been kind of driving ourselves mad here with the political partisanship, and to have a closely contested election would be very unsettling to the bond market, to the stock market, to all of us, I think. It would be resolved. Obviously, at some point, we will have a president. But if it takes months, it could mean that the rest of the year will not be a great one for the financial markets.
That is the market nightmare very few want to see. Ed, thank you, sir. Ed Yardeni of Yardeni Research. Equities doing better this morning, up by 0.6% on the S&P, with an update on stories elsewhere. Here's your Bloomberg Brief with Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. The yen weakening this morning to a 3-month low. Japan's ruling coalition failed to win a majority in parliament for the first time since 2009. The concern that political instability would translate to a less hawkish BOJ. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba promised to restore stability, indicating that he plans to forge ahead with putting together an administration and continue on as prime minister. Olympus shares are falling in the Japanese trade. The company pushed out its CEO after investigating allegations that he purchased illegal drugs. Stefan Kaufmann, who was on the job for less than 2 years, resigned all positions effective immediately. Olympus is best known as a designer of cameras and imaging gear before a pivot into medical equipment. The company declined to comment, citing the ongoing investigation. Indonesia has blocked Apple from selling its iPhone 16 in the country. Officials say that the company hasn't met local investment requirements. Now, Apple does rank outside the top 6 smartphone brands in Indonesia, but it's a potential growth market with a young, increasingly tech-savvy population. And that's your brief, John.
Hey, Danny, thank you. Appreciate it. A little bit of breaking news out of Germany. This coming from the VW Labour chief. Volkswagen seeking to close at least 3 German plants and downsize all remaining plants in the nation. Some big news potentially for Volkswagen and the German economy.
Yeah, this actually was somewhat expected just because we had heard warnings to that extent, and yet interesting that we have not heard from policymakers what they can do. This from the Works Council Chief Daniela Cavallo, who also sits on VW's supervisory board. This means taking out even more products, quantity shifts, and entire assembly lines far beyond what we have already done so far.
Is this the decision or a start of a bigger negotiation with interested parties? I sense it's the latter.
There is going to be an even greater push saying if you want this industry to be here and to be thriving, you need to provide us some help.
Ollie Crook out of Berlin joining us in about 15 minutes' time on this story. Don't miss that. Up next on this program, Donald Trump headlining the Garden.
We must defeat Kamala Harris and stop her radical left agenda with a landslide that is too big to rig. Kamala, you're fired. Get out. Get out.
That conversation up next, live from New York City this morning. Good morning.
vibrant resources and high-yield investment opportunities abound. Join me on Horizon Middle East and Africa for the stories, newsmakers, and insights from this exciting region. Now weekdays, only on Bloomberg.
Morning, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda.
Taking you from the U.S. market's close to the overnight session in Asia. We'll walk you through what you need to know to kickstart the European trading day. Live from our European headquarters, we bring you the day's top market-moving stories, unmatched expert analysis, and on-the-ground reporting from across the continent. Tune in every weekday at 6 a.m. London time, only on Bloomberg Television.
Ways on the heartbeat of the tech
Spread across global markets.
Real-time data aspect is going to be
We're going to bring you expert analysis on that shortly.
Don't miss Bloomberg's interview with
Live from New York City, equity futures up by 0.6% on the S&P 500. Under surveillance this morning, Donald Trump headlining The Garden.
We must defeat Kamala Harris and stop her radical left agenda with a landslide that is too big to rig. This election is a choice between whether we will have 4 more years of gross incompetence and failure, or whether we will begin the 4 greatest years in the history of our country. Kamala, you're fired. Get out. Get out.
So here's the latest this morning. Donald Trump amping up supporters at a packed Madison Square Garden during a nearly 6-hour rally as the race for the White House enters the home stretch. The former president was backed by dozens of speakers, from Elon Musk to House Speaker Mike Johnson. Joining us now around the table, former US Ambassador to Switzerland, Ed McMullen, who was there in the stadium. Ambassador, good to see you. Good morning.
Good to see you. Good morning.
We've got to start, unfortunately, with a comedian called Tony Hinchcliffe, who made some disparaging remarks about Puerto Rico. How unfortunate is it that this event is being overshadowed by that? And what's your reaction to that this morning?
Well, I think that the American people are smart enough to sift through the nonsense. There were probably 30 speakers that spoke, including the president, the vice president, all of whom were focused on the economy and the future of America. And for the media to fixate on one comedian who I never even saw. I was in the motorcade with the president. He got on early, never even heard him speak. So I don't really know what he said, but I can tell you now, what everyone else was saying was right to the point, right to the heart of what Americans truly care about.
But Ambassador, with all due respect, it's not the media, it's the Republican Party. You had Senator Scott of